You think poor man meals meant going without flavor or dignity? Think again. Families across America stretched pennies into dishes so hearty and satisfying, no one at the table ever felt deprived. Let's dig into 100 poor man meals no one makes anymore. Instant oatmeal muffins were breakfast alchemy at its absolute finest, a miracle born out of leftovers and imagination. You'd empty a few packets of flavored oatmeal, apple, cinnamon, maple, or whatever was left, into a mixing bowl, crack in an egg, add a splash of milk, and stir until it looked close enough to real batter. The texture wasn't perfect, but that didn't matter. You'd pour it into greased muffin tins and bake it just long enough for the kitchen to fill with the smell of brown sugar and comfort. Moms picked up the trick from neighbors, TV ads, or recipe clippings taped to the fridge. 2 oatmeal packets could somehow stretch into 6 muffins, and that was magic in itself. They came out soft, warm, and sweet, just right for little hands on their way to school. Raisins made them feel fancy, chocolate chips made them feel like dessert, and even plain they hit every craving. Instant oatmeal muffins weren't about showing off, they were about showing love with whatever you had. They were the kind of breakfast that didn't look like struggle, it looked like care. For families trying to stretch the grocery bill one more week, that was everything. Cornbread and honey was one of those simple comforts that made every 1960s kid feel like they were getting away with something sweet before dinner. Mothers made cornbread from the cheapest ingredients you could find in any pantry. A little flour, a little cornmeal, a little milk, and maybe an egg if the week had been kind. The batter came together quickly, but the moment it hit the oven, the whole house transformed. That warm, buttery smell drifted through every room, telling kids exactly what was coming without a single word being spoken. When the cornbread came out, golden and steaming, it felt like a gift. Mothers sliced it into thick squares, the kind that crumbled just a little at the edges, and handed it out while it was still warm enough to melt anything that touched it. Then came the honey drizzled or poured, depending on how generous she felt that day. The honey seeped into all the little cracks, turning a humble piece of bread into something rich and sticky and perfect. Kids loved how the sweetness balanced the savory corn flavor, creating a dessert that was not technically a dessert but felt exactly like one. It was cheap, filling, and made from ingredients almost every family always had on hand. Mothers relied on it because it stretched tight grocery budgets without ever feeling like a compromise. Kids begged for it because it tasted like warmth, like comfort, like the kind of simple sweetness that sticks in your memory long after you grow up and realize how much your mother made out of so little cornbread and honey was proof that dessert did not have to be fancy to be unforgettable. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches were the sweet spot between hunger and childhood. No stove, no knife skills, no effort. Just 2 slices of white bread, 1 spread of peanut butter, 1 of jelly, smashed together until they stuck. You did not toast it, you did not plate it. You wrapped it in napkins or ate it straight from the counter. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was always there. The peanut butter clung to the roof of your mouth. The jelly ran down your fingers, and somehow you never minded. It felt like a treat even though it was a budget lifeline. You ate it when the pantry was bare and the lunchbox had to look full. You ate it at home, at school, and on car rides when the air conditioning did not work. It was portable, durable, and forgivable. No one asked questions if that was your meal again, because everyone understood. It was the great equalizer of being broke. No leftovers, no dishes, just sweetness, salt, and survival on sliced bread. Oatmeal. Gruel was one of the humblest depression foods, often reserved for children, the elderly, or the sick. Rolled oats were boiled in water until thin and soupy, sometimes flavored with milk if it could be spared, or a sprinkle of sugar when available. It lacked richness, but it was nourishing and easy to digest, which made it practical when stronger meals were impossible. For many families, oatmeal gruel was served as both breakfast and dinner, stretching a handful of oats across several bowls. Though plain, it provided much-needed energy and warmth in a time when calories were hard to come by. Parents ate less of it themselves, saving portions for their children. While it might not have been anyone's favorite meal, it carried the comfort of something warm in otherwise hungry days. For countless households, oatmeal gruel was both a symbol of hardship and proof of how people endured with the simplest foods. Bacon rind stew was the art of borrowing flavor without spending meat. When the bacon was gone, the rinds, the tough, fatty edges, were what remained. Saved in coffee tins or wrapped in wax paper, they waited until the next stew. Dropped into water, they softened slowly, releasing salt, smoke, and the ghost of pork. Onions came next, maybe beans, maybe potatoes if the root cellar had not gone bare. The rind never disappeared completely. It just grew tender enough to chew if you dared, or fish out if you were polite. But the flavor lingered. It made the whole pot taste like bacon, even if there was no bacon in it. That was the trick. That was the genius. You fed a family on what most would have thrown away. The broth turned rich and deep. It smelled like Sunday. It felt like home, even if your shoes were patched and your coat too thin. Bacon rind stew did not pretend to be anything fancy, but it warmed the hands. It silenced the table, and it reminded everyone eating it that poverty could be proud, too. Barley and mushroom gravy bowl brought hearty texture and deep flavor to the dinner table using ingredients that cost only pennies per serving. Pearl barley was simmered until tender and spooned into bowls, then generously topped with a thick mushroom gravy made from sautéed onions, sliced mushrooms, and a splash of milk or broth. The barley's nutty chewiness paired perfectly with the savory gravy, creating a meal that was both comforting and surprisingly filling. This dish proved that meat was not necessary to achieve a rich, satisfying flavor, making it popular among families seeking economical vegetarian options. Barley stored well and cooked in bulk, so a single bag could supply multiple meals over the week. The recipe also welcomed leftovers, allowing home cooks to add bits of vegetables or herbs on hand without increasing the cost. Served with a simple green salad, barley and mushroom gravy bowl became a quiet star of thrifty 1960s kitchens, showcasing how whole grains and careful seasoning could create a dinner that felt indulgent despite its humble origins. Flour barrels were the throne of every kitchen, the one thing no home could function without. A big barrel of flour in the corner meant security. It meant bread, dumplings, biscuits, and gravies for days. Poor men guarded their flour like treasure because one scoop could mean breakfast for the family. When you opened the lid and saw a fine white cloud rise, it felt like hope itself. Housewives made biscuits on wooden boards, cutting circles with cups when they had no proper tools. Dumplings floated in broth like little clouds, thickening soups that could stretch another night. Flour was also the base for gravy, that golden miracle that turned scraps into feasts. The smell of hot flour and fat cooking together was as close as you got to luxury on a poor man's plate. It was simple, practical, and pure, proof that even the most basic things can hold a kind of sacred power when times are hard. The barrel stood as a silent promise that tomorrow's meal was already halfway there. Fried bologna chips were genius, born out of boredom and thrift. You took a slice of bologna, cut it into quarters, and tossed it into a hot skillet until it curled up like bacon and popped around the edges. The smell alone could pull anyone to the kitchen. The sizzling sound was pure comfort, like something important was happening on the stove. A paper towel would soak up the grease, and before long, you'd be snacking on salty, crispy bites that tasted like meat candy. It was perfect for game nights, cheap beer, or payday eves when you wanted something crunchy without opening a bag of chips. Some folks dipped them in mustard, others stacked them between white bread with a smear of mayo. It wasn't fancy, it was food that did its job. Fried bologna chips were the working-class answer to bacon, proof that good flavor didn't need a big budget. It was something to look forward to after a long week, and in its own greasy way, it made life taste a little better. Apple core pork stew sounded like a contradiction, but it worked better than you'd think. The cores, sticky, pitted, fibrous, weren't meant for pies, but for pots. They were dropped into a bubbling stew of pork scraps, mostly fat and bone, to balance out the salt with a hint of sweet. The sugars cooked down, the flavor spread. Apples and pork, an old pairing, but this was the budget version. The bones gave body, the cores gave brightness, and together they made something humble, taste like something thoughtful. If you had onions, in they went. A splash of vinegar made it sing. Bread on the side, stale or not, caught whatever clung to the bottom of the bowl. You did not brag about this stew, but you asked for seconds, because it filled the belly and tricked the tongue into thinking someone had planned it. Apple core pork stew was a quiet reminder that sweetness often came from what others threw away. Rice croquettes were a depression trick for turning yesterday's leftovers into something new and appetizing. When rice was cooked in large batches, families often had more than they could finish, and waste was simply not an option. Leftover rice was mashed together with a bit of flour or egg when available, then shaped into small balls and fried in a skillet with fat or drippings. The result was a golden, crispy outside and a soft, chewy inside that children especially loved. Adults appreciated how croquettes added texture and flavor to meals that were otherwise bland. They could be served with gravy, broth, or just eaten plain, offering flexibility depending on what was on hand. In some households, croquettes became the centerpiece of dinner when no meat was available. They proved that resourcefulness in the kitchen could transform scraps into something enjoyable. Families remembered rice croquettes not just as a thrifty dish, but as a rare moment when leftovers felt special instead of repetitive. They were simple, but in hard times, simplicity was often the best comfort of all. Corn and cottage cheese pie turned two budget staples into a surprisingly elegant dinner dish that impressed guests as well as family. Sweet corn kernels, either fresh or canned, were combined with creamy cottage cheese, beaten eggs, and a touch of flour to create a smooth filling that set beautifully inside a simple pastry shell. Baking brought out a gentle sweetness that paired perfectly with the tang of the cheese, making each slice rich yet light. This pie was easy to prepare ahead of time and served equally well warm or at room temperature, an advantage for busy hosts or church suppers. The ingredients were inexpensive and widely available, making it an accessible option for families looking to stretch their food dollars without sacrificing flavor. Leftovers held up well and could be enjoyed for breakfast or lunch the next day. Its enduring charm lies in how it transforms humble pantry items into something that feels like a special occasion, capturing the inventive spirit of 1960s American home cooking. Fried potatoes and onions were the poor man's hash, a skillet full of sizzling honesty. You sliced the potatoes thin, tossed them in a pan with oil or bacon grease, and added onions until the whole house smelled like something was finally cooking. It was loud, smoky, and always worth the wait. The edges got crispy, the centers stayed soft, and the onions caramelized just enough to make you forget there was no meat. There was no recipe, just instinct and repetition, the kind passed down by watching, not reading. One pan, one burner, and the hope that there was enough to go around. You flipped it with whatever spatula had not melted yet, served it right out of the pan, and ate it fast before the crisp turned to mush. This was breakfast, lunch, or dinner, whatever you needed it to be. You could dress it up with ketchup or cheese or just eat it plain. No one judged. It was filling, cheap, and tasted better than most things you could afford. In the right moment, it tasted like comfort. In the wrong one, it tasted like the only option. But either way, it got the job done. Oven-baked potato wedges were the crispy, perfectly seasoned alternative to store-bought fries that kids loved even more. Mothers cut potatoes into thick wedges, tossed them with a little oil and seasoning, and let the oven work its magic. As they baked, the edges crisped while the centers stayed soft and tender. Kids hovered near the oven window, waiting for that moment when the wedges turned golden brown. The smell alone promised something delicious. When served, they were hot, salty, and easy to dip in ketchup, making them irresistible. Mothers loved how affordable and healthy they were compared to anything from a diner kids begged for them because they tasted like real fries without the cost. Simple, crunchy, and comforting, these wedges were a quiet weeknight favorite in countless 1960s homes. Fried potato peel chips proved that nothing went to waste in the thrifty kitchen. When you peeled potatoes for dinner, you saved every strip, rinsed them, and threw them into a hot pan of oil until they curled and browned. Sprinkle salt, and suddenly you had the crispest, saltiest snack imaginable. It was crunchy, earthy, and satisfying in a way that store-bought chips could never match. Poor families knew better than to toss good food away, and this snack was living proof. Kids would snatch them from paper towels while they were still warm, mouths burning, but too happy to care. It was the kind of food that made the kitchen smell rich even when you had nothing fancy to cook. Fried potato peel chips were a masterclass in making something from scraps, turning the parts others threw away into a reason to smile. Fried pinto beans were the real muscle behind every hard-time meal. They were humble, sure, but they were also one of the most important foods ever stocked in American pantries. Poor men relied on them because they were cheap, filling, and versatile enough to become anything, from stews to soups to spreads. You could buy a big sack of dried beans for a few cents, soak them overnight, and stretch one pot into several days' worth of dinners. When meat disappeared from the table, beans stepped up. Mothers would season them with salt pork or just a spoonful of lard, maybe toss in an onion if they had one. The result was hearty and comforting, proof that flavor could be coaxed out of almost nothing. Beans didn't just feed stomachs, they fed communities. Churches, farms, and neighbors shared sacks during bad winters, knowing that beans meant everyone would eat. The smell of a bean pot simmering on the stove was a signal of warmth, of life continuing even when money was tight. They were the kind of food that asked for patience but gave back comfort in return, a true testament to the art of surviving with grace. Canned milk corn chowder was a soup that hugged you from the inside. You'd open a can of evaporated milk, pour it into a pot, add a few handfuls of frozen corn and some instant potato flakes, and let it all come together over a low flame. The result was thick, creamy, and comforting, the kind of meal that tasted richer than your wallet said it should. It warmed you up fast and made you feel like you had something special on the stove. This was a dinner for cold nights, small paychecks, and big appetites. Even without bacon or cream, it had depth, thanks to the sweet corn and that canned milk tang. Served with a few crackers or a slice of bread, it made a full meal out of almost nothing. Canned milk corn chowder wasn't just food. It was a reminder that with a pot, a can, and a little patience, you could turn scarcity into comfort. Peanut butter celery logs were the silly, crunchy snack that made kids feel like they were eating something special, even when it took almost no effort to make mothers spread peanut butter into the grooves of crisp celery sticks, sometimes adding raisins on top if they wanted to be fancy. Kids loved the contrast, the cold crunch of the celery, the creamy peanut butter, the sweet little bursts from the raisins. It felt playful, like a treat disguised as something healthy. Mothers appreciated how cheap and quick it was, especially for after-school hunger. Kids begged for it because it tasted fun, not just good. Peanut butter celery logs were the kind of simple joy that defined childhood snacking in the 1960s. Canned ravioli was the Italian dinner that came in a can and never asked for praise. You popped open the metal lid, poured the heavy red sauce into a pot or a bowl, and microwaved it until it bubbled around the edges. The smell was artificial, the sauce too sweet, and the ravioli too soft, but none of that mattered, because it was food. And sometimes, that was the only requirement. Chef Boyardee was not a chef in your kitchen, he was a lifeline, a shortcut to something that felt like a meal, even if it came from a shelf instead of a stove. You ate it straight from the bowl, sometimes with a slice of bread to soak up the sauce. Other times, just a fork and a quick prayer that no one noticed how many nights in a row you were eating the same thing. The meat inside the pasta was more memory than substance, a whisper of protein in a sea of tomato. But it was hot, and it was filling, and it kept the stomach quiet when the cupboards were mostly bare. You were not proud of it, but you were grateful, because for $1 or less, it gave you something to hold on to. Parsley noodle pudding brought a delicate herbal note to the classic baked noodle dish, turning inexpensive staples into a fragrant supper centerpiece. Wide egg noodles were cooked until just tender, then mixed with milk, eggs, a little butter, and a generous handful of freshly chopped parsley before baking to a golden finish. The custard base held everything together while the parsley added color and a bright, garden-fresh taste that lifted the entire dish. This pudding was equally welcome as a vegetarian main course or as a side alongside roasted vegetables. Because the ingredients were inexpensive and easy to keep on hand, it fit perfectly into the thrifty mindset of 1960s households. Home cooks appreciated how it could be assembled in advance and baked just before serving, freeing time for family or guests. Children enjoyed the mild flavor and silky texture, while adults admired its simple elegance. Parsley noodle pudding remains a quiet reminder that with a little imagination, even the most modest pantry can produce a meal worth remembering. Cornmeal dumplings in broth were one of those Depression-era tricks that turned the most modest soup into something that felt like a meal. Flour and wheat were often expensive, but cornmeal remained relatively cheap and widely available. Families would mix cornmeal with water and a little salt to form a simple dough, shaping it into small balls and dropping them into a pot of thin broth. The broth itself could be made from vegetable scraps, meat bones, or even just salted water. But once the dumplings simmered and swelled, the dish felt hearty. Mothers often relied on this trick to stretch a single pot into enough servings for large families. Children loved the dumplings because they had a soft, chewy texture, almost like a treat floating in their soup. Adults valued the filling quality, which helped stave off hunger when no second helpings were possible. Cornmeal dumplings showed the ingenuity of turning something inexpensive and basic into comfort food. In many households, this dish became a staple, remembered later not for its luxury, but for the way it managed to make empty cupboards feel just a little less empty. Turnip top stew was green, gritty, and grown from what wealthier folks left behind. The tops, the leafy, tangled bits hacked off and discarded, were gathered from markets or pulled from backyard soil. Washed, chopped, and boiled with potatoes, maybe beans, maybe a sliver of bacon. The flavor was bold, peppery, a little muddy, but it was real. No one paid for turnip tops. That was the point. They were free, unwanted, but not useless. Simmered long enough, they turned soft, then silky. They gave the stew life. The broth darkened to green gold. A crust of bread made it a meal. And suddenly, the poorest part of the plant became the heart of supper. Turnip top stew was not fancy, but it was proof that the line between trash and treasure is thinner than you think. In tough times, people learned that what others discarded might still hold enough to nourish. Potato rarebit was one of the Depression's clever ways to make potatoes feel more special than they were. The base idea was to take mashed or sliced potatoes and top them with a thin sauce of cheese, milk, and spices. Cheese was often scarce, so the sauce was made with very small amounts stretched as far as possible, sometimes even flavored with mustard to give it more punch. The result was a dish that felt rich and indulgent, even though it used little more than potatoes and scraps of cheese. Families would bake or broil it to give the top a golden crust, making it even more appealing. It was filling, cheap, and versatile, perfect for serving a large family. Children especially loved when potatoes got transformed this way, since it was a rare chance to enjoy something creamy and flavorful. Potato rarebit may not be common today, but it was beloved back then. Raisin rice. Pilaf proved that a meatless dinner could still feel special and satisfying when handled with care. White rice was simmered slowly with a bit of butter until each grain was tender, then tossed with plump raisins that had been soaked in warm water to bring out their natural sweetness. A pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg added gentle spice, turning plain rice into a fragrant dish that filled the kitchen with an inviting aroma. Many 1960s households served this pilaf as a main course on nights when meat was too expensive, or saved it for church suppers where a simple vegetarian option was welcome. It paired beautifully with a crisp green salad or a side of baked apples, creating a balanced meal from inexpensive ingredients. Leftovers reheated well for breakfast with a drizzle of honey or a splash of milk. The dish showed how a few pantry staples could stretch a grocery budget and proved that even the simplest ingredients could deliver comfort and a hint of elegance at the dinner table. Mock veal loaf delivered the flavor of expensive beans and cornbread was the gospel of the broke South. Pinto beans soaked overnight, slow-cooked all day, and served steaming hot with a thick slice of cornbread. This was not just dinner. This was survival seasoned with tradition. The beans were soft and earthy, flavored with salt, onions, or maybe a ham hock if someone blessed you. The cornbread was crumbly and golden, sometimes sweet, sometimes not, depending on what part of the country raised you. It was not just a recipe, it was a ritual passed down from someone who learned to stretch a dime into dignity. Even if it was humble, it still brought people to the table like it was a Sunday feast. You broke off chunks and dipped them into the beans like it was communion. And in some ways, it was. Families gathered around it. Conversations started over it. Empty stomachs were quieted by it. It was a meal you could eat for days without getting tired of it because it tasted like home, like history, like someone cared enough to soak the beans instead of rushing a can. And even if they had to rush it, canned beans and boxed cornbread mix, it still counted. It always did. Potato pancakes made from leftover mashed potatoes were the definition of turning almost nothing into something incredible. Mothers loved this recipe because it let them stretch every scrap and avoid waste, but kids loved it because those little golden patties tasted like a true treat. It started with a bowl of cold mashed potatoes, stiff and slightly lumpy from the night before. Mothers would mix in a little egg, a bit of flour, some onion if they had any left, and seasonings that were often more instinctual than measured. She would shape the mixture into small patties and drop them onto a hot, buttered skillet. The sound alone was enough to pull kids away from whatever they were doing. The edges browned first, creating that crispy ring that every child looked for before taking a bite. The inside stayed soft, creamy, and warm, almost like mashed potatoes in their coziest form. The contrast between the crisp exterior and the tender interior made every bite exciting. Some kids dipped them in ketchup, others ate them plain, but everyone agreed they were one of the best things to ever come out of a leftover bowl. Mothers appreciated that it cost nothing extra, but still felt like a real meal. Kids begged for them because they tasted like comfort made fresh again, like getting something new out of something old. They were the kind of food that made you forget you were eating leftovers because they were even better the second time around. Potato pancakes were a thrifty triumph, a childhood favorite, and a reminder that sometimes the best meals are the ones born out of necessity and a little creativity. Butterbean burgers were the quiet champions of the broke man's dinner table, turning pantry scraps into something worth savoring. You'd start with a can of butter beans, mash them until smooth, and mix in breadcrumbs, an egg, and a pinch of salt and pepper. When fried, the patties crisped up perfectly, the edges golden brown and the centers creamy like mashed potatoes. The beans brought a rich, earthy flavor that made you forget there wasn't any meat involved. You could serve them on bread with mustard, stack them like real burgers, or eat them straight from the skillet with a fork. They filled you up fast and cost next to nothing, a miracle in itself. Families loved how far one can could go, and kids didn't mind because they tasted good. It was one of those rare recipes that started from desperation but stayed for its flavor. Butterbean burgers proved that meat wasn't the only thing that made a meal feel whole. They were born from necessity but carried pride, the sound of sizzling oil marking another night conquered. Poverty taught people to adapt, but these burgers taught them to thrive. Cornmeal was the magic dust of poor households, cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly useful. A single sack could turn into mush for breakfast, hoe cakes for lunch, and cornbread for dinner. Farmers used it, miners used it, families swore by it. Cornmeal was filling, nutritious, and worked with just about any leftover you had lying around. It was the one ingredient that could carry you through a whole week of hunger without complaint. People used it with lard drippings to make golden cakes crisp on the edges and soft in the middle. For others, it meant a pot of warm corn mush, sweetened with molasses or salted for a savory twist. Kids grew up on it, and mothers stretched it with water when milk was gone. When the pantry looked bare, cornmeal never disappointed. It was the friend that always stayed. Its grainy texture and rich smell of roasting corn were the scent of home for millions. Even today, there's something grounding about a skillet of cornbread, reminding us how far thrift and a bit of grit could take a person. Powdered milk chocolate pudding was the sweet ending that made every tight grocery week feel worth it. You'd mix dry milk with cocoa powder, sugar, cornstarch, and a little water, whisking fast until it came together into a glossy brown dream. It simmered slow on the stove, thickening just enough to coat the spoon. Once it cooled, it went into reused butter tubs or chipped mugs, then straight into the icebox until firm. The first spoonful was pure bliss, smooth, sweet, and just chocolatey enough to make you forget how simple it was. Kids licked the pot clean, laughing at the sticky whisk marks on their fingers. Nobody cared that it wasn't real milk. What mattered was that it felt indulgent. Sometimes you'd top it with whipped cream from a can or a sprinkle of sugar if you wanted to be fancy. It was cheap, it was easy, and it made even the hardest weeks taste soft around the edges. Powdered milk chocolate pudding was proof that sweetness didn't come from money. It came from patience, persistence, and love stirred over a warm stove. Hamburger hash was the skillet miracle that made every child in the house sprint to the kitchen the moment they smelled it cooking. Mothers made it by combining ground beef, diced potatoes, onions, and whatever seasonings they had on hand, stretching a small amount of meat into a meal that fed everyone without costing much. The potatoes would brown slowly, getting crisp on the edges and soft in the middle, while the onions melted down into something sweet and perfect. The beef sizzled alongside everything, creating this savory blend that filled the entire home with a smell that no hungry kid could resist. It was a one-pan treasure, the kind of meal that made the kitchen feel warm and alive. Kids loved it because every spoonful felt different. Some bites more potato, some more meat, some deliciously heavy on onion. It was the kind of dish you could pile high on a plate and still go back for seconds, even thirds if you were lucky. Mothers liked that it stretched ingredients, saved money, and kept stomachs full for hours. Many families added ketchup, some added gravy, some ate it exactly as it came out of the pan. There was no wrong way to enjoy hamburger hash. It was cozy, hearty, and the definition of comfort food long before that phrase became trendy. Kids begged for it because it tasted like home in the most uncomplicated way possible, like the kind of dinner that made the whole family sit together without any fuss. It was simple, cheap, and unforgettable, which is exactly why it became a quiet legend in so many 1960s homes. Meatloaf was a handshake between hard times and good intentions. It was not steak, it was not even roast. It was ground beef stretched with breadcrumbs, onions, and eggs, molded into a loaf like it wanted to be something more. You baked it in a pan until the edges browned, and if you had ketchup, you glazed the top until it caramelized into a sweet, sticky crust. Meatloaf was a family meal, a leftover meal, a please God let this last 3 days kind of meal. It sat in the center of the table like it was proud to be made out of scraps. And maybe it was. It held together, even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. Slice by slice, you ate it with mashed potatoes or just plain white bread, soaking up every bit of flavor. It was dense, it was heavy, and it was honest. Because meatloaf never pretended to be more than what it was, a way to make something out of not enough. Baked lima bean patties transformed a pantry staple into a crispy, protein-rich entree that required very little money or effort. Cooked lima beans were mashed with breadcrumbs, minced onion, and a touch of seasoning before being shaped into small cakes and baked until golden on the outside while soft within. The gentle flavor of the beans paired well with a spoon of tomato relish or a drizzle of simple white sauce, offering a balanced and filling meal. Because dried beans were inexpensive and stored for months, this recipe provided a dependable option for families watching their grocery bills. Children often enjoyed the mild taste, especially when the patties were served on soft rolls like a vegetarian burger. Homemakers appreciated that they could prepare the mixture in advance and bake it just before dinner, keeping evenings stress-free. Baked lima bean patties demonstrate the quiet creativity of mid-century kitchens, where resourceful cooks turned everyday staples into meals that were hearty, healthy, and surprisingly elegant for such modest ingredients. Homemade crackers were one of the simplest yet most practical foods people baked during the Depression. With store-bought crackers and snacks out of the question, Families turned to flour, water, and a pinch of salt or lard to make thin crisps. Rolled flat and baked until golden, they provided crunch and variety in a diet that was otherwise dominated by soft, starchy foods. Often, children would snack on them plain, while adults used them to stretch soups, broths, and thin stews. They could be topped with whatever was on hand, from drippings to a smear of carrot marmalade, but even alone they were satisfying in their simplicity. Families appreciated how they required little fuel and ingredients, and they became a staple for households that could not afford bread every day. Homemade crackers reflected resilience, showing how even the most basic pantry items could be transformed into something useful. They were not glamorous, but they were dependable, which is exactly what people needed most. Leftover gravy stew was built from yesterday's triumphs. Every browned bit scraped from the pan, every spoon of gravy saved in a jar. No one wasted a drop. It all went into the pot. Gravy too salty, gravy too thin, gravy gone cold and clumpy. It did not matter. Once heated and stirred, it turned into something new. The base was thick and muddy, brown like old leather and heavy with memories. Add water to stretch it. Add potatoes or rice to fill it. Sometimes a scrap of meat, forgotten in the fridge or hidden in the freezer, would join in. But mostly it was the gravy doing the work, holding everything together like glue, like tradition. There was no recipe, just instinct, a dollop of last week's roast, a spoonful from a chicken dinner, the flavors layered, mingled, and transformed. Children never questioned it. They just knew it was warm and rich and familiar. Leftover gravy stew was not elegant, but it was honest. It told the truth about how people survived, by saving, scraping, and stirring their way to another meal. Peanut soup was a filling option that came straight out of the need for protein when meat was too expensive or unavailable. Ground peanuts simmered with water or milk created a creamy, nutty broth that was surprisingly hearty. Onions, celery, or a bit of leftover potato might be added to give it body, but the peanuts did most of the heavy lifting. The flavor was rich enough that it almost felt indulgent, even though it cost very little to prepare. Served with cornbread or biscuits if available, it could stretch into a complete meal for an entire family. Many households in the South relied on peanuts as a cheap crop, and this soup was a natural way to put them to use. For many children who grew up during the Depression, peanut soup became a nostalgic memory of warmth and survival, showing how simple ingredients could stand in for things they could not afford. Cheddar grits casserole brought Southern comfort to weeknight tables while cleverly using scraps to stretch a grocery dollar. Cooked grits were stirred with sharp cheddar cheese, a splash of milk, and any small bits of leftover ham before being baked until the top formed a golden crust. The creamy base and salty accents provided warmth and satisfaction, making it a favorite for cool evenings or family gatherings. Because grits were inexpensive and widely available, this casserole offered a filling main dish that fed many mouths without straining a budget. Home cooks often prepared it in the morning and reheated it for supper, appreciating how well it held its texture. Children loved the mild cheese flavor, while adults enjoyed the hearty, stick-to-your-ribs appeal. Paired with a green salad or simple stewed tomatoes, the dish delivered balanced comfort with little expense or effort. Its staying power in community cookbooks and church potluck menus shows how thrifty Southern traditions easily blended with mid-century convenience to create a meal everyone could enjoy. Hot dogs and baked beans were the dinner of choice when you had 5 mouths and $1. This was not about taste. This was about calories. You dumped a can of beans into a pot, sliced up some hot dogs, and let the whole thing simmer until it bubbled like lava in a cartoon. The beans were sweet, sticky, and filled with brown sugar or molasses, depending on the brand or the sale. The hot dogs were sometimes boiled first, but usually not. They were cut into coins and stirred in like meat confetti. You served it with white bread, not because it matched, but because it was there. No plates necessary, just bowls and spoons and the quiet acceptance that this was dinner, again. For some kids, this meal was a treat. For others, it was a warning sign. You knew what kind of week it was by how often it showed up. Still, it filled you up, and that mattered. The salt hit your tongue and stayed there. Even now, you probably remember that smell. Sweet, smoky beans and sizzling hot dogs coming from a chipped pot on a rusty stove. Oven-baked drumsticks were the budget-friendly superstar of the 1960s dinner table, turning ordinary nights into something that felt special. Drumsticks were the cheapest chicken cut, stretching into enough portions for the whole family without costing much. Mothers seasoned them with whatever was available and let the oven do the work as the skin crisped and the meat stayed juicy. The rich, savory smell drifted through the house, calling kids into the kitchen long before dinner was ready. Kids loved eating them with their hands, feeling like the whole drumstick belonged just to them. Mothers loved how easy and foolproof the recipe was. When the tray came out, golden and tempting, kids devoured them with excitement. Simple but joyful, oven-baked drumsticks proved that the best meals did not need to be fancy to feel like a feast. Ritz Cracker Tuna Melt Bake was the definition of 1980s ingenuity, a dinner built from scraps that somehow felt like a feast. You'd mix canned tuna with a spoonful of mayonnaise, maybe stretch it with a little celery or onion if you had it, and spread it into a battered casserole dish. Then came the magic. A blanket of crushed Ritz crackers sprinkled over the top, glistening with butter, and a few slices of processed cheese layered for good measure. When it baked, the edges browned, the middle bubbled, and the smell filled the whole apartment like hope. It looked like luxury, but it was born from frugality. You could feed a whole family on one can of tuna and half a box of crackers and still have leftovers for the next day. Kids fought over the crispy top layer while parents smiled in relief. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable, comforting, and rich in all the right ways. This dish didn't just fill plates, it filled the silence that hunger left behind. Ritz Cracker Tuna Melt Bake turned a handful of cheap ingredients into something that tasted like victory after another long, hard day. Evaporated and powdered milk were the quiet heroes of the poor man's pantry, the kind that didn't look like much but made all the difference. When fresh milk was too expensive or too far to fetch, these tins stepped in. Powdered milk mixed with water could be used for baking, breakfast, and even feeding babies when nothing else was around. Evaporated milk had that thick, sweet flavor that made coffee richer and pies creamier. It was comfort in a can. People learned to trust it because it never spoiled and could sit on a shelf for months. During lean winters, that security meant everything. You'd see families mix a little milk powder with oats, stretch it into gravy, or stir it into mashed potatoes. It might not have been the farm fresh kind, but it carried the same warmth. For many, those tins meant nourishment and dignity in a time when both were scarce. Macaroni with butter and cheese powder was one of the most requested comfort meals of the entire decade, a dish that took almost no time to make but somehow lived rent-free in the memories of every child who grew up in the 1960s. It started with a simple pot of boiling water and a box that promised creamy, cheesy goodness without costing very much at all. Those little elbow noodles dropped into the water like tiny soldiers, rising and sinking while kids watched the steam swirl around the kitchen. When the noodles softened and the water got drained, that was when the magic began. A little butter, a little milk, and that iconic packet of cheese powder turned everything bright orange in a way that felt exciting, almost like you were watching color appear right out of thin air. Kids loved stirring it, even if their mothers always had to fix it afterward because kids never quite got the cheese mixed in all the way. But the taste was what mattered. It was salty, creamy, warm, and cozy, like taking a bite out of happiness itself. It stuck to the spoon in a way that promised you would not be hungry again anytime soon. Mothers served it on busy nights, lazy afternoons, weekends, and days when the weather looked gloomy and everyone needed something cheerful. It was cheap, filling, and dependable, the kind of meal that felt like a little celebration even when there was no reason to celebrate. Kids begged for it constantly, probably more than any other meal because it tasted like childhood in its simplest form. No pretension, no fuss, just pure comfort that came from a box and made the whole day feel better. Liver and onions were the meal that tested your strength. This was not a dinner kids begged for. It was one you survived. A plate of pan-fried beef liver, dark and dense, smothered in soft, translucent onions that were supposed to make it taste better. The smell alone was enough to make you gag. But liver was cheap, it was full of nutrients, and it was not rationed like other cuts during wartime. So you ate it. You cut tiny pieces and tried to swallow without chewing. You drowned it in ketchup or mustard, anything to make it go down faster. Your parents called it good for you. You called it punishment. But there it was, week after week, staring back at you from a chipped plate, while the onions slid around like ghosts. And if you finished it, you felt like you had won something. You had not. But you felt that way. And sometimes, that was enough. Rutabaga and carrot mash brought together two hardy root vegetables that thrived in cold climates and offered dependable nourishment long after harvest. Peeled rutabagas and carrots were boiled until tender, then whipped with butter and a sprinkle of black pepper into a smooth, golden mash. The natural sweetness of the carrots balanced the earthy flavor of the rutabaga, creating a dish that felt both rustic and refined. Because these vegetables stored well in cellars for months, families could rely on them for inexpensive winter meals when fresh produce was scarce. The bright color and gentle taste appealed to children, while adults appreciated the hearty texture and vitamins packed into every spoonful. Served alongside roasted chicken when budgets allowed or enjoyed on its own with a slice of bread, rutabaga and carrot mash exemplified the 1960s emphasis on making the most of seasonal vegetables. It remains a comforting side or main dish that highlights how frugal ingredients can combine to create something far greater than the sum of their humble parts. Breaded tomato slices were a Depression-era favorite when green or underripe tomatoes were all that gardens could spare. Rather than waste them, families would slice the tomatoes thick, dip them in a little cornmeal or flour, and fry them until golden. The result was crisp on the outside, tangy inside, and surprisingly satisfying. Sometimes salt or pepper was added, but often they were served plain, still managing to feel like a treat in households where luxuries were rare. This dish became especially popular in rural areas where families grew their own produce and needed creative ways to use every part of the harvest. Children enjoyed the crunch, and adults valued how it stretched a small supply of vegetables into something filling. Breaded tomato slices became both a side dish and sometimes even a main meal, depending on how scarce other foods were. They reflected both thrift and resourcefulness, proving that even unripe produce could be transformed into comfort food. Liver scrap stew was a dish born out of necessity, made from the cheapest cuts of beef liver, those ragged, bitter ends that the butcher often discarded or sold for pennies. These scraps were chopped finely or ground by hand to maximize their flavor, then sautéed slowly with onions until the sharp metallic smell softened into something rich and almost sweet. The liver was never eaten alone. It was always mixed with potatoes, beans, or leftover grains to stretch the meal further and hide some of the strong taste. Its iron tang was unmistakable, clinging stubbornly to the teeth and tongue, a reminder of the harsh realities of poverty and rationing. Children often recoiled at the taste, but parents insisted it was good for the blood, a phrase that carried the weight of generations. Sometimes vinegar or mustard was added to cut the bite and make it more palatable. Liver scrap stew was more than just a meal. It was an act of pride, a refusal to waste anything edible. It was the taste of thrift and resourcefulness in lean times, when every scrap mattered. Though it was never a treat, it fed families and kept bodies strong, standing as a symbol of making the most from the least available. It was a testament to survival when abundance was a distant memory. Apple peel jelly was the perfect example of Depression frugality, showing how even scraps could become something sweet. When apples were peeled for pies or other dishes, thrifty homemakers saved the skins rather than discarding them. These peels were boiled with sugar and water, sometimes with a bit of lemon peel until they turned into a flavorful jelly. The jelly could be spread over bread, crackers, or biscuits, instantly brightening the table. It was not as rich as traditional jams, but for families who had little, it felt like a luxury. Children loved the sweet tang, and parents took pride in knowing nothing went to waste. Apple peel jelly was especially popular in rural areas where orchards were common, and every harvest meant piles of peels waiting to be reused. For families struggling through hunger, it was a reminder that comfort could be coaxed from even the most unlikely ingredients. It became both a necessity and a tradition, keeping hope alive through sweetness. Apple sausage bread. Pudding married sweet and savory flavors in a way that perfectly captured the experimental spirit of the 1960s kitchen. Day-old bread cubes soaked up a custard of milk and eggs before being mixed with diced apples and small bits of sausage for richness. The dish baked until the top turned golden and the apples released their gentle perfume, filling the home with an inviting scent. By using stale bread and modest amounts of meat, thrifty cooks created a dinner that felt both indulgent and practical. The sweetness of the fruit balanced the smoky sausage, while the custard kept every bite moist. Families often served it with a simple green salad for contrast or a drizzle of maple syrup when they wanted extra sweetness. This recipe highlighted the era's willingness to blend unexpected flavors while keeping costs low. Leftovers reheated beautifully for breakfast the next day, making it a true two-meal wonder that reflected the frugal yet inventive cooking style of mid-century American households. Chili and crackers were the meal you made when you needed fire in your belly and not much else. Ground beef, a can of beans, tomato sauce, and every spice you could find in the back of the cabinet. You let it simmer until it thickened, bubbling and bold, the kind of dish that fogged up the windows and warmed up the room. You served it with saltine crackers, always saltines, stacked on the side or crumbled right in. Sometimes there was shredded cheese, sometimes a dollop of sour cream. But usually, it was just the basics. And that was fine, because chili did not need help. It had enough heat, enough bite, enough heart. You ate it with a spoon too big for the bowl and left the table feeling like you had won something. Maybe you had. Baked ham slices with pineapple rings were the simple, budget-conscious way mothers brought a little holiday spirit to an ordinary night. Instead of buying a whole ham, which was far too expensive for many families, they used thin slices that cooked quickly and filled the kitchen with a rich, salty smell. The pineapple rings made everything feel festive, their syrupy sweetness soaking into the ham as it baked. Kids loved how bright and cheerful the dish looked, the glossy fruit sitting right on top like something out of a magazine. Mothers loved how easy it was, just a few ingredients layered on a pan and placed into the oven. When it came out bubbling and golden at the edges, it felt like a celebration even when nothing special was happening. For kids, it tasted like the fancy meals they imagined other families ate, even though theirs was made with thrift and creativity. It was proof that you could turn something inexpensive into something joyful with almost no effort. Biscuit dough pizza boats turned canned biscuits into dinner for a crowd. You'd flatten each one into a little bowl, spoon on tomato sauce from a jar, sprinkle shredded cheese, and maybe add a slice of pepperoni if you were feeling fancy. Pop them in the oven and watch as they puffed and browned, smelling like pizza night on a dime. Kids loved them because they were small enough to hold, and parents loved them because they cost next to nothing. They looked cute, tasted amazing, and disappeared before they even cooled. It was the kind of meal you could make out of leftovers and pantry scraps without needing a recipe card. The 1980s were full of little tricks like this, turning store-brand dough and canned goods into a moment of joy. Biscuit dough pizza boats weren't just food, they were a celebration of what imagination could do on a shoestring budget. Salt pork and lard were the beating heart of every poor man's pantry. When you think of survival food, you probably imagine beans or bread, but it was actually fat that kept most families alive through harsh winters. Salt pork was the flavor base, the miracle worker, and the cheapest source of calories anyone could get their hands on. It was heavily salted so it would not spoil and could last for months in a cool pantry, making it a godsend when refrigeration was a luxury. People would slice it thin and use just a little piece to fry potatoes, season beans, or grease a skillet before making cornbread. Every drop of lard saved from Sunday dinners went into a tin bucket because nothing was wasted. You could bake with it, fry with it, even spread it on toast if times were really desperate. The smell of lard sizzling on an iron pan became a kind of comfort, the sound of someone trying their best. Kids would joke about fat bread breakfasts, but they ate it happily. There was a quiet pride in making something out of scraps, in keeping bellies full without going hungry. Those buckets of lard were as valuable as gold to a household, standing for patience, frugality, and the sort of cleverness that came from doing more with less. You might not see lard buckets in a modern kitchen anymore, but back then, they meant survival, pure and simple. Baked beans on toast were the sweet and savory treat that 1960s kids loved far more than anyone would expect from something so modest. The beans came from a can, thick and glossy, smelling like brown sugar and slow cooking. Even though they had been made in a factory, mothers heated them in a pot until they bubbled softly, creating a scent that made hungry kids rush into the kitchen. While the beans warmed up, the bread went into the toaster, and that crispy foundation was what made the whole thing feel special. Once the toast popped, mothers would spoon the beans on top until the entire surface was covered, letting the sauce drip over the sides. Kids dug in immediately, often burning their tongues because they were too impatient to wait. The contrast of crunchy toast and soft beans made every bite feel exciting, and the sweetness in the sauce made it taste almost like a dessert pretending to be dinner. It was cheap, quick, and undeniably comforting. Mothers relied on it during tight weeks when money was short and time was even shorter. Kids begged for it not because it was fancy, but because it was dependable, delicious, and somehow always tasted better at night when the whole house felt quiet. It was one of those meals that did not try to impress anyone, and yet it impressed kids every single time. Butter and sugar sandwiches were the childhood candy of the broke and content. 2 slices of white bread, a spread of butter, and a sprinkle of sugar. That was dessert. Kids came home from school hungry, opened the pantry, and made these without asking. Sometimes the butter wasn't real butter, but margarine, slick and sweet just the same. It wasn't fancy, but when you bit into it, the crunch of sugar met the softness of bread in the most perfect way. It was cheap joy in the shape of a sandwich, a moment of sweetness when life was rough around the edges. Parents made them too, not just for kids, but for themselves, because a bite of that sugar and butter sandwich tasted like nostalgia. It reminded them that even when the world felt out of reach, they still had bread, sweetness, and a reason to smile. Spam and eggs were the emergency dinner that never felt like one. Spam was the meat that came in a tiny rectangular can, and once you heard that suction sound as it slid out, you knew what was coming. You sliced it thick or thin, fried it in a pan until it crisped at the edges, and served it alongside scrambled eggs that may or may not have come from a powder. It was salty, greasy, and surprisingly good, if you grew up eating it, that is. Some people looked down on Spam, but when money was tight, Spam was a lifesaver. It had a long shelf life, required no refrigeration, and could be stretched across several meals. It showed up in casseroles, sandwiches, and stews, but next to eggs, it felt like breakfast for dinner, which somehow made everything okay. You would douse it in ketchup or hot sauce, whatever you had, and you would eat it at a small table with mismatched chairs and flickering lights and think, this could be worse, and it often was. Eggplant Parmesan casserole gave budget-minded families a taste of Italian-inspired comfort without the cost of imported ingredients. Slices of eggplant were lightly breaded, quickly browned in a skillet, and layered with canned tomato sauce, dried oregano, and a modest sprinkle of grated cheese. Baked until the sauce bubbled and the cheese melted, the dish emerged fragrant and hearty, ready to feed a hungry household. Because eggplant was plentiful in late summer and canned tomatoes were available year-round, the recipe fit perfectly into a thrifty meal plan. Many 1960s home cooks discovered it through community cookbooks that encouraged vegetable-centered dinners when meat prices rose. Served with a side of spaghetti or crusty bread, it felt festive enough for company while staying within a modest budget. The mild flavor of the eggplant absorbed the savory sauce beautifully, making each bite satisfying without the need for heavy amounts of cheese or meat. Eggplant Parmesan casserole quickly became a reliable favorite for families eager to stretch their food dollars while still offering something warm and flavorful. Boiled turnip tops were a staple born of necessity, proving that even the green leaves most people might throw away could keep families alive. Turnips were affordable, hardy vegetables that grew well in poor soil, and when their roots were harvested, the greens were never wasted. Women would wash and boil the tops in a simple pot of water, sometimes seasoning only with a pinch of salt if they had it. The greens cooked down into a soft, bitter but nutritious dish that helped fill stomachs when nothing else was available. Occasionally, if there was bacon fat or lard to spare, the leaves would be flavored more richly, but most of the time it was plain boiled greens. Children often disliked the taste, but parents insisted, knowing the vitamins were essential in years when fresh vegetables were rare. For many rural households, boiled turnip tops became a daily food, reminding them of how survival depended on using every single part of the harvest. Evaporated milk and pea stew was what you made when fresh food was a rumor and the pantry was all cans. A tin of evaporated milk, thick, sticky, and faintly sweet, poured into a pot of boiling water with a drained can of peas. That was it. Maybe a spoon of lard, maybe a pinch of salt. The peas floated like green eyes in a pale, milky broth. It looked strange, it tasted stranger, but it was warm, and it filled you. That creamy texture fooled your stomach into thinking it had eaten more. The peas, soft and briny, reminded you that vegetables once grew in the ground. Your grandfather probably ate this during the war, your grandmother during the ration years. It was survival sealed in tin and disguised as comfort. Evaporated milk and pea stew did not taste like hope, but it tasted like trying. And in times like those, trying was the greatest gift anyone could offer. Beet and potato hash celebrated color and economy in equal measure, offering a hearty skillet meal from two of the most affordable vegetables around. Diced beets and potatoes were pan-fried with onions in a bit of oil or leftover drippings until the edges turned golden and crisp. The beets added a deep ruby hue that stained the potatoes with a cheerful pink, making the dish as attractive as it was filling. A sprinkle of vinegar or a dollop of sour cream brought brightness to each bite, proving that frugal cooking could still deliver vibrant flavor. This hash was often served as a meatless main course or topped with a poached egg for extra protein, making it ideal for households watching their grocery spending. Gardeners loved it because it used ingredients that stored well through winter, ensuring a dependable dinner even when fresh produce was scarce. Beet and potato hash remains a classic example of how mid-century cooks turned basic staples into something comforting, flavorful, and visually striking without spending more than a few coins. Cabbage soup was the dinner of last resort, but it never let you down. You took a head of cabbage, chopped it rough, and threw it into boiling water or broth. Add onions, add carrots, add whatever vegetables you could scrounge from the crisper. The broth was thin, sometimes flavored with a bouillon cube, sometimes just salt and pepper. But it filled the house with steam and the smell of something cooking, something real. You served it in big bowls, sometimes with bread, sometimes without. It was watery. It was plain, but it was warm, and it kept your belly full. Some families made it with a little ground meat or sausage if they had it. Most just leaned on the cabbage and hoped it stretched far enough. It was not the kind of soup you bragged about. But it was the kind you remembered, because it showed up when there was almost nothing left. Banana pudding with vanilla wafers was one of the greatest budget desserts of the 1960s, the kind that made kids run to the kitchen the second they saw the bowl. Mothers liked it because it used inexpensive ingredients that turned into something special with very little work. The pudding was whisked until smooth and layered with bananas and wafers, each layer adding softness and sweetness. Once chilled, the cookies softened just enough to feel cake-like, creating that perfect creamy bite kids loved. It tasted like Sunday afternoons and family moments. Mothers served it on ordinary days or when bananas were starting to brown, and kids treated it like a celebration every single time. It was cheap, easy, and unforgettable, a dessert that felt like comfort itself. Cheese water soup might sound pitiful at first, but to families scraping by, it was survival disguised as comfort. When the pantry was empty, the milk long gone, and payday still days away, A spoonful of powdered cheese stirred into boiling water was enough to lift spirits. The steam carried the smell of warmth, even if the meal itself was little more than wishful thinking. Parents whisked it fast so the powder would melt smooth, creating the illusion of a creamy broth. A few shakes of pepper or a torn piece of stale bread on the side turned it into a full supper. Kids didn't question it. They called it cheese soup and slurped it proudly. It was salty, thin, and simple, but it filled the belly and soothed the mind. For adults, it was less about flavor and more about dignity, proof that even when the cupboards were bare, there was still something to feed the family. Cheesewater soup wasn't a dish people bragged about making, but everyone who lived through hard times remembered it. It was the taste of perseverance poured into a chipped bowl, reminding everyone that even the humblest meal could feel like home. Spoonfuls. Dried saltfish was a poor man's meat, cheap, salty, and ready to last through any storm. Before refrigeration, this was how families near the coasts stayed fed all winter. Fishermen would pack the catch in layers of salt until the flesh turned firm and dry, locking in the flavor. Once you had it, all you needed was water and patience to bring it back to life. Rehydrated, fried, or stewed, it carried the taste of the sea and the grit of survival. Poor households found ways to stretch even a small piece into a full pot of chowder or beans. The smell might have been strong, but so was the satisfaction. Salt fish connected entire communities, from the docks of New England to the rural South, where people learned to turn scarcity into tradition. It was proof that with enough salt, skill, and determination, nothing had to go to waste. Hot dogs and pork and beans were the kind of meal that felt special even though everything came from a can or a simple package. Mothers liked it because it was easy, and kids loved that sweet and salty mix that felt like comfort in a bowl. She sliced the hot dogs, let them sizzle in a skillet, then poured the thick beans over the top so everything could bubble together. The smell alone made kids hover around the stove waiting for their plates. It was cheap, filling, and needed nothing but a fork or a piece of toast to feel complete. Some families added onions, others kept it plain, but every family agreed it tasted like the best kind of simplicity. It reminded kids of slow evenings, a little extra fun, and moments when something ordinary felt exciting. Hot dogs and pork and beans were joyful, easy, and exactly what childhood dinners were supposed to feel like. Rice and gravy was the meal that whispered, "We made it work," after a long, hungry day. Plain white rice, nothing more than starch and steam, was cooked in big pots that never emptied as fast as you thought. And the gravy? That was magic. You scraped the bottom of the meat pan, mixed the fat and flour, maybe some milk if you were lucky, and stirred until it thickened. There was no meat, not really, just the memory of it. But the gravy carried the flavor like a story passed down from better times. You poured it over the rice and watched it disappear into the grains, turning white into brown, bland into bold. It was hot, heavy, and exactly what you needed. Sometimes there was no salt, sometimes no butter, but always the same bowl, the same spoon, the same quiet hope that tomorrow's meal would be more. Rice and gravy was not flashy, it was not celebrated, but it showed up and it stayed. Hot dog fried rice was the 1980s answer to fast food when nobody could afford the drive-thru. You'd grab the leftover rice from the night before, toss it into a skillet, and chop up a few hot dogs to throw in. The soy sauce packets saved from cheap takeout finally earned their keep, sizzling as they hit the pan. The smell filled every corner of the kitchen, salty and smoky with a little sweetness from the rice. If you had an egg, you'd crack it right in and stir fast, watching it turn the whole thing golden. If you didn't, no one complained. The hot dogs carried enough flavor to make it feel like a real meal. It looked humble, but it tasted like triumph. Families made it at the end of the week when groceries ran low, and somehow it always hit the spot. It stretched scraps into dinner, turned leftovers into pride, and reminded everyone that creativity was just as filling as wealth. Kids didn't know it was poverty food. To them, it was comfort on a plate. Hot dog fried rice was the flavor of resilience. sizzling proof that even struggle could taste good if you knew how to fry it right. Onion and herb biscuit pie delivered layers of savory aroma and flaky texture while using only basic pantry ingredients. Sliced onions were slowly caramelized with butter and a handful of fresh or dried herbs until sweet and fragrant, then spread in a baking dish and topped with soft biscuit dough. As the pie baked, the onion filling bubbled up and mingled with the biscuits, creating a rich sauce beneath a golden crust. The combination offered a satisfying balance of sweetness from the onions and earthiness from herbs such as thyme or parsley. Because onions were inexpensive and stored well, this recipe quickly became a go-to for frugal households seeking warmth and flavor without expensive meats. It could be served as a vegetarian main dish or as a hearty side for roasted vegetables, making it adaptable to whatever else was on hand. Onion and herb biscuit pie captures the resourceful creativity of mid-century cooks, proving that even the simplest staples can become a centerpiece when treated with care and patience in the oven. Mock banana pudding was the sort of dish that showed just how inventive Depression-era cooks could be when real ingredients were simply out of reach. Bananas, once imported luxuries, quickly became too expensive for families to buy. To make up for it, people leaned on banana extract, which could be purchased cheaply and used sparingly to add flavor, layered with homemade custard, when eggs and milk could be spared, and stacked between vanilla wafers or leftover bits of stale cake. The pudding felt surprisingly close to the original. Families would chill it in an icebox if they had one, though often it was served warm right from the stove. For children, it was a rare treat that offered the illusion of a fruit dessert, even if no fresh fruit was present. In many homes, mock banana pudding became a stand-in for celebration desserts, stretching scarce supplies into something families could still enjoy together, and for many, it carried the sweetness of hope itself. Boiled onion stew was the meal you made when there was almost nothing left to make a meal from. Just onions, maybe two, maybe one if that was all you had, sliced into ribbons and dropped into boiling water. Salt, if you were lucky. Pepper, if someone had saved a pinch. The pot simmered until the onions went translucent, soft enough to spoon, thin enough to stretch. The broth was pale gold, sweet from the onion's surrender. That was dinner. Served with a hunk of bread, stale and tough, but still sacred. People dipped it, chewed slow, closed their eyes, and tried to imagine something richer. It was not filling. It was not thick, but it was hot, and that counted for something. For families whose stoves had grown quiet, this stew brought back the sound of boiling. It brought back the smell of onions in the air, faint though it was. You could feed 6 with one bulb if you tried hard enough. That was the magic, or the tragedy. Maybe both, but no one ever forgot the taste, because it tasted like resilience, like making something out of nearly nothing. And sometimes, that had to be enough. Molasses jugs were the sweetness in a bitter life. Cheap and long-lasting, molasses could turn the plainest meal into something special. You could drizzle it on cornbread, stir it into beans, or mix it with hot water for a makeshift tea. It had a deep, smoky sweetness that tasted like comfort itself. Poor families loved it because it was cheaper than sugar and lasted 10 times longer. A single jug could see a household through months of tight times. Kids dipped biscuits in it, farmers used it to sweeten their coffee, and mothers poured it into cakes when they wanted to feel fancy. That thick, dark syrup was more than food. It was memory in liquid form. When money was thin and cupboards nearly bare, molasses was the one indulgence you could still afford. It reminded people that joy could still exist in small, sticky spoons. Mayonnaise and tomato saltines were what passed for luxury when the lights were dim and the pantry looked bare. You'd take a sleeve of saltines, smear each one with a bit of mayonnaise, then press on a slice of tomato fresh from a neighbor's garden or the grocery discount bin. Sprinkle a little salt, maybe pepper if you had it, and you were set. Folks called them poor man's canapés, but they tasted like victory after a long day. It was the kind of snack you made barefoot at the kitchen counter with a glass of sweet tea sweating beside you. Kids thought it looked strange, but always came back for another bite because it hit that perfect balance between creamy, salty, and sharp. You could find families across the South and Midwest doing the same thing late at night, catching reruns on television with a paper towel full of saltines in hand. There was no need for fine dining or silver spoons, just a little mayonnaise, a ripe tomato, and something cold to drink. It wasn't just a snack. It was a reminder that the simplest things could feel fancy when you needed them to. Cheese toast under the broiler was the quick, melty after-school snack that could turn even the longest day around. Mothers made it because it took only a slice of bread, a sprinkle of cheese, and a few minutes under the broiler. As soon as the cheese bubbled and browned, the whole house smelled warm and comforting. Kids rushed to the kitchen the moment they heard that little sizzle. The edges of the bread crisped up while the center stayed soft, and the cheese melted into a perfect golden layer that stretched when they pulled it apart. It was simple, cheap, and endlessly satisfying. Mothers appreciated that it filled hungry kids fast without requiring a full meal. Kids begged for it because it felt indulgent, even though it was made from the most basic ingredients. Cheese toast was the kind of small pleasure that defined 1960s afternoons, warm and familiar in all the right ways. Fried rice was the kitchen's answer to, "What can I do with leftovers?" You took yesterday's rice, never fresh, always cold, and tossed it in a hot pan with oil. Add eggs if you had them. Add vegetables if they were not wilted. Add soy sauce and stir until everything sizzled. Sometimes there was meat, bits of chicken, strips of Spam, leftover pork chops cut into tiny pieces. It was not a recipe. It was a response to scarcity. Every ingredient was a compromise that somehow came together as comfort. You learned to make it without measuring, without rules, just instinct and need. But often, it was just rice and hope. Fried rice was the clean-out-the-fridge dish, the we-cannot-waste-anything dish. It was salty, savory, and never tasted the same way twice. But it always worked. It fed a crowd, it reheated well, and it made you feel like a real cook, even if all you did was throw things in a pan. Vegetable curry stew introduced a mild touch of international flavor to American kitchens while staying firmly in the realm of affordable comfort food. Potatoes, carrots, onions, and canned chickpeas simmered slowly with a gentle dusting of curry powder, filling the house with a warm, spiced aroma that felt both new and familiar. The recipe was flexible enough to accept any vegetables on hand, making it ideal for gardeners or thrifty shoppers. During the 1960s, when interest in global flavors was growing, this stew offered a budget-friendly way to explore something different without leaving the home kitchen. Served with plain rice or a slice of crusty bread, it delivered a complete protein and plenty of satisfying texture. Families discovered that the spices brightened otherwise simple ingredients, proving that excitement at the dinner table did not require expensive meats or specialty imports. Vegetable curry stew stands as a delicious example of how mid-century cooks embraced fresh ideas while still practicing the frugality and adaptability that defined their daily meals. Corn cob broth stew asked you to believe in what was already gone. The corn was eaten, of course, but the cobs, stripped, gnawed, and dry, were dropped into a pot and simmered for hours to pull out whatever ghost of flavor they had left. The broth turned golden, sweet, and faintly smoky. Into that went whatever scraps remained: a potato, a handful of beans, a sprig of parsley if someone still had a garden. The cobs were taken out before serving, but the warmth lingered. It tasted like memory, like summer's shadow. Some said it was not real stew, but to the ones who made it, it was. It meant nothing was wasted. It meant supper still came, even when the field was bare. There is something sacred in that kind of belief, in boiling bones and husks and peels, because hope is cheaper than groceries. Corncob broth stew was never about hunger. It was about refusing to believe the cupboard was truly empty. Salted popcorn supper might sound like a snack today, but during the Depression it often stood in for a real meal. Popcorn was inexpensive, easy to make in large quantities, and filling enough to take the edge off hunger. Families would pop big bowls of it, sprinkle salt over the top, and gather around to share it for dinner. While it lacked the nutrition of meat or vegetables, it was a warm, shared experience that brought families together. Children saw it as a treat, while adults knew it was simply necessity disguised as fun. Sometimes popcorn was paired with milk or molasses water to add substance, but often it stood on its own. Neighbors also used popcorn suppers at gatherings, stretching limited food to feed a crowd. The dish represents how families redefined what supper meant when resources were at their lowest. It was proof that even the humblest food could provide comfort when eaten together, turning scarcity into moments of connection and shared resilience. Cornflake-crusted fish squares were a playful answer to the challenge of making inexpensive whitefish appealing to the whole family. Thin fillets of cod or haddock were cut into squares, dipped in milk and egg, and coated with crushed cornflakes left over from breakfast. Baking or frying turned the cereal coating into a crisp, golden crust that sealed in moisture and added a gentle sweetness. This recipe allowed households to use affordable frozen fish while giving it a texture reminiscent of more expensive fried seafood. Children found the crunchy coating irresistible, and parents enjoyed how quickly the dish came together on busy weeknights. The cornflakes acted as an economical substitute for breadcrumbs and made use of pantry items that might otherwise go stale. Served with a squeeze of lemon or a side of tartar sauce, these fish squares brought a fun and frugal twist to the dinner table, showing the inventive spirit of 1960s cooking where nothing in the kitchen ever went to waste. Tuna noodle casserole was the king of kitchen creativity. If you had a can of tuna, a box of noodles, and a single can of soup, you had dinner. This was the casserole that held families together after World War II, the kind of meal that said, "We are broke, but we still eat warm." You dumped the noodles in boiling water, stirred in the tuna, and cracked open that can of cream of mushroom soup like it was the secret to survival. It all went into one big dish, mixed until gray and gloppy, then topped with whatever crunch you could find. Maybe crushed potato chips, maybe stale breadcrumbs. If you were lucky, a little shredded cheese. But that was rare. Tuna noodle casserole was not supposed to taste good. It was supposed to be enough. And it was. It warmed up the house and made it smell like something was baking. That mattered more than you think. Sometimes it fed 6 people on $3. Sometimes you made it again the next day with what was left in the pan. It was frugal, filling, and strangely comforting. And if you grew up poor, it probably sat in front of you more times than you care to admit, steam rising off the top like it was proud to be what it was. Frito pie in its cafeteria style was the chaotic, crunchy, messy masterpiece that 1960s kids absolutely adored. It was not fancy or expensive, but it tasted like pure childhood joy. Corn chips formed the base, sometimes poured onto a plate, sometimes eaten straight from the bag. Hot chili or seasoned beef melted the chips just enough, and a shower of cheese glued the whole thing together. Kids loved the mix of textures: crispy edges, soft centers, savory meat, and gooey cheese. It felt fun and a little rebellious, like party food pretending to be dinner. Mothers loved how quick and cheap it was, perfect for busy nights. To kids, it tasted like loud cafeteria lunches, and after-school laughter. Frito pie was pure 1960s magic, unforgettable to anyone who grew up with it. Oatmeal patties came from mornings when waste was unthinkable and every leftover had a second act. Cold oatmeal from breakfast would be mixed with an egg, maybe some flour, and fried up like pancakes in a sizzling pan. They crisped on the outside and stayed soft in the middle, smelling faintly of cinnamon or whatever sugar you'd stirred in before. It was the kind of breakfast that made sense in tight times. You already had it, so why not make it better? You could spread a little syrup on top or just eat it plain, standing at the stove with the spatula still in your hand. Kids didn't complain. They thought it was new, not recycled. Families who grew up poor never forgot oatmeal patties because they represented something special, making the most of what was left. Even when money got better, you'd find people still frying them up out of habit. The golden edges, the smell of butter, the sizzle, it was breakfast reborn. Hamburger stew was the cozy, simmering bowl that brought families together on chilly evenings. Mothers browned a bit of ground meat, then added potatoes, canned vegetables, and broth until everything blended into a rich, hearty mixture. It filled the kitchen with a deep, comforting smell that lingered for hours. Kids loved dipping bread into the broth, soaking every last bit. The stew was simple but full of flavor, warming from the inside out. Mothers made it because it stretched ingredients and fed everyone without effort. Kids begged for it because it felt like real homemade food, the kind that made the whole evening slower and softer. Hamburger stew was pure comfort in a bowl, made from almost nothing but tasting like everything a family needed. Cornbread and milk was a southern lullaby disguised as dinner. You took day-old cornbread, dry, crumbly, almost stale, and dropped it into a glass of cold milk. No sugar, no spice, just spoon and memory. It was humble food, the kind you did not question because your grandparents ate it too. Some people used buttermilk, others regular. It depended on what was left in the fridge and how soft you needed the bread to be. You ate it with a spoon, slowly, like it was soup. It filled you without asking for attention. It was cheap, simple, and oddly soothing. There was something honest about it, like admitting you had little but making peace with it anyway. In some homes, this was a treat. In others, a last resort. Either way, it kept bellies full and silence at the table. That matters more than most people know. Peanut butter and celery rice surprised many families with its simple combination of protein and crunch, while staying true to the spirit of economical cooking. Hot-cooked rice was stirred with a generous spoon of peanut butter until it melted into a creamy coating, then finished with finely diced celery for freshness and texture. The nutty flavor provided satisfying richness without the need for meat, while the celery added a pleasant bite that kept each spoonful lively. Children enjoyed the mild sweetness of the peanuts, and parents appreciated how the dish delivered both carbohydrates and protein at a very low cost. It could be served as a warm side dish or as a light vegetarian main course alongside a crisp salad. This inventive recipe reflected the era's openness to global influences and practical experimentation, proving that even unexpected pairings could become a family favorite. Peanut butter and celery rice stands as a delicious reminder of how 1960s cooks stretched their budgets while creating meals that were nourishing, flavorful, and delightfully different. Molasses water was one of the simplest Depression-era energy boosters, and it carried a surprising amount of cultural weight. White sugar was often scarce and costly, but molasses was cheaper and packed with minerals like iron, which people desperately needed. Families would stir a spoonful of molasses into a glass of water, creating a sweet, dark drink that was both energizing and inexpensive. Children drank it before heading to school, and workers often relied on it to get through long hours of labor. It tasted strong, sometimes too strong for delicate palates, but its sweetness made it more welcome than plain water. Molasses water was also used as a quick fix when other drinks like milk or coffee were out of reach. For many rural families, it became a symbol of thrift and nourishment, stretching the value of every ingredient. It was not a luxury or even a treat. It was a necessity, one that reminded people of the importance of resourcefulness. In its simplicity, molasses water reflects how people created sustenance out of almost nothing and carried on despite hardship. Hot dog and rice stew was not about meat. It was about the memory of meat. One single hot dog, sliced into 10 thin coins, fried just long enough to scent the air and tint the oil. Then came the rice, cheap and bottomless, absorbing whatever was left. A bit of celery if it had not gone rubbery. A carrot nub shaved into slivers. The trick was timing. Let the hot dog cook too long and it vanished. Too short and it stayed rubbery. But done just right, it fooled the tongue into thinking you were eating something hearty. The broth, if you can call it that, was barely more than salted water and grease. But it shimmered. And when it hit the table, steaming and pink around the edges, children smiled. It looked like dinner. It sounded like dinner. That one hot dog stretched like a miracle across 6 bowls. They never forgot it, not because it was delicious, but because it was enough. And sometimes, enough is all anyone is really hoping for. Powdered cheese rice came straight from the era of boxed dinners and instant fixes. When the macaroni ran out, but that bright orange packet of cheese dust was still sitting in the box, you made do. You'd toss it into a pot of leftover rice with a splash of milk or margarine, stir until everything turned creamy, and serve it like it was gourmet. It was the taste of the 1980s on a budget. Salty, neon orange, and undeniably satisfying. Parents knew it would fill stomachs fast, and kids didn't know they were eating leftovers dressed up as something special. You could stretch one box of mac and cheese into 3 nights of dinners if you were smart about it. That glowing cheese powder had a power of its own. It made anything feel a little indulgent, even plain rice. Powdered cheese rice was comfort disguised as convenience, a hack born from necessity and nostalgia. Peanut butter and banana sandwiches were the sweet, sticky, unbelievably satisfying snacks that kids begged for the moment they walked through the door after school. There was something almost magical about how 2 basic ingredients could turn into a treat that felt both fun and filling. Mothers loved making them because they required no cooking, no cleanup, and almost no money. Just slice a banana, spread the peanut butter thick enough that the bread stuck to your fingers, and press it all together. The moment you took a bite, the peanut butter glued everything together in that slow, chewy way that made kids talk funny until they swallowed. The bananas added just the right amount of sweetness, almost like having dessert disguised as a sandwich. Some kids liked the bread soft, others liked it lightly toasted so the peanut butter melted a little into all the corners. No matter how it was served, it always tasted like the kind of snack that made bad days better and good days even more exciting. It was also the perfect fuel for running outside to play, riding bikes, or disappearing into the backyard until dinner. Mothers loved that it kept kids full without stretching the grocery budget in any painful way. It was cheap, healthy enough for the time, and comforting in a way that never seemed to get old. These sandwiches tasted like childhood freedom, like being able to run barefoot without a care in the world. And that is exactly why kids begged for them, day after day, like it was the best invention anyone had ever come up with. Fried bologna sandwiches were the poor kid's steak. You slapped that bologna in a hot pan until it curled like a rose petal, then threw it on white bread with a smear of mustard. If you were lucky, a slice of cheese made an appearance. If not, the bologna had to carry all the weight. It sizzled, popped, and released that smell, salty, greasy, unmistakable. There was always that little charred ring around the edge, a perfect halo of survival. This was not deli meat. This was the cheapest pack in the fridge. It came in a big plastic tube, sealed with a twist tie or worse, and you knew it was going to last all week. You did not toast the bread. You barely buttered the pan. The goal was simple: get it hot and slap it together. Sometimes there was ketchup, sometimes a pickle slice. But most times, it was just the basics, a sandwich that told you exactly where you stood. You sat on the floor or leaned over the sink while you ate it, grease dripping down your hand, and never questioned why this was a staple. Because it worked, and because it was yours. Celery and cheese soufflé brought elegance to an inexpensive vegetable that most people considered only a snack or soup ingredient. Finely chopped celery was sautéed with a bit of butter and folded into a fluffy base of beaten eggs and grated cheese before being baked until the top rose and browned. Despite its sophisticated appearance, the ingredients were simple and affordable, making it a popular choice for dinner parties on a budget. The soufflé delivered a gentle crunch from the celery against the airy texture of the eggs, surprising guests who expected something plain. Because the recipe relied on pantry staples like milk, eggs, and a small amount of cheese, it fit perfectly into the frugal cooking philosophy of the time. Home cooks loved that it felt fancy without requiring costly ingredients or specialized equipment. Served with a crisp salad or a slice of toasted bread, this dish turned an ordinary evening into a special occasion and demonstrated how a humble vegetable could take center stage in a memorable meal. Ketchup sandwiches may sound like a joke today, but in the Depression era, they were a quick meal for children and adults alike. With meat out of reach for many, a slice of bread spread thin with ketchup became lunch or even dinner. The tangy, sweet flavor gave the illusion of something more filling, especially when paired with a second slice of bread. Sometimes butter or margarine was added if available, but most of the time it was just bread and ketchup. While humble, it provided calories when little else was around, and children often looked forward to it simply because it tasted different from the usual plain bread. It was also portable, making it an easy option for workers or school lunches. Though it might not sound appetizing now, it kept hunger away for countless families. For many who grew up in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches became an unforgettable part of their childhood survival. Ketchup soup stew started out as a joke, but not the funny kind. When the tomatoes were gone and the cans were too expensive, families reached for what little sweetness they had left: packets, pumps, and sticky bottles of ketchup. 2 or 3 squirts, some boiling water, and a prayer. Add elbow noodles or rice if you had it. Maybe half an onion, chopped thin enough to melt. The ketchup colored the broth red, tricking the eye into believing it was tomato stew. It was not. But that was the trick. That was the magic. Your grandfather might have slurped it down and said, "Tastes just like Heinz." But no one was laughing. This was what you ate when the only store left was the diner's condiment counter. Sometimes a piece of bread got dunked in. Sometimes a cheese rind floated like a lifeboat. It was survival, disguised in red. And no one ever forgot the taste, not because it was good, but because it meant someone still tried to make a meal out of nothing. Fried saltines were the unofficial snack of the broke, hungry, and resourceful. Crackers were cheap and always around, and all you needed was a skillet with a bit of oil. You'd toss in a handful of saltines, let them pop and crisp up, then dust them with salt or pepper, or sometimes just eat them plain and hot. The result was something so simple it almost felt like a secret. The crunch was addictive, the smell buttery even when no butter was used. People made them late at night after long shifts, when dinner had been a memory hours ago. Fried saltines made you feel like you were treating yourself, even though you were just stretching the last crumbs of the pantry. It was survival food disguised as a snack, and it kept more people fed than you'd think. Macaroni and tomatoes were a Depression-era classic, simple, humble, and oddly satisfying. This was not pasta. It was just boiled elbow noodles drowning in stewed tomatoes, maybe with a spoonful of butter if you had it. Some families added sugar to cut the acidity, others added salt and pepper and called it gourmet. Either way, it was a bowl of starch and acidity that somehow passed for dinner. You would eat it with a fork because spoons were for people who made soup. Macaroni and tomatoes made no apologies. It was what you threw together when the pantry had almost nothing but cans and carbs. It filled your stomach and quieted the kind of hunger that made your ribs ache. And sometimes, just sometimes, it tasted like home. The sauce stained your bowl orange and clung to the bottom like it wanted to stay. If you ever asked what was for dinner and got this, you knew things were tight. And you also knew not to complain, because no one had time for complaints. You just ate, chewed slow, and wondered how something so bland could feel so familiar. That is what makes it special. It was not delicious, it was dependable. Pea and egg salad plate was a thrifty supper that turned humble staples into a refreshing main dish for a warm evening. Canned peas were drained and chilled before being folded with chopped hard-boiled eggs, diced celery, and a splash of mild vinegar dressing. A pinch of dry mustard or a spoon of mayonnaise added just enough richness to bind everything together while still keeping the cost low. Served on crisp lettuce leaves or alongside sliced tomatoes from the backyard garden, it provided protein and texture without any need for meat. Home cooks loved how quickly it came together using pantry items that were inexpensive and easy to find year-round. Children enjoyed the gentle sweetness of the peas, while adults appreciated the subtle tang from the dressing. This simple combination was light enough for summertime, but filling enough to carry a family through a busy evening, reflecting the practical yet creative spirit of mid-century kitchens, where canned vegetables and eggs formed the backbone of many dependable weeknight meals. Crispy fish sticks with ketchup were the oven-baked heroes of weeknight dinners, especially when mothers needed something quick that still felt fun. Kids knew the sound of the frozen sticks hitting the metal tray, stiff and pale before the oven worked its magic. As they baked, the smell grew warm and inviting, and kids would check the window for that golden edge that meant the crunch would be perfect. Mothers loved them because they were cheap, easy, and guaranteed to stop complaints. When the tray came out, kids rushed to the table with their plates ready. The first bite always had that satisfying crunch, followed by soft fish inside. Dip after dip into ketchup made the meal feel playful, like a tiny restaurant experience right at home. Fish sticks tasted like relaxed evenings, simple comfort, and just enough excitement to make dinner special. Kids begged for them because they never felt boring no matter how often they appeared. They were cheap, cheerful, and unforgettable. Wilted lettuce stew was never on a menu, but it was always in the garden, just past its prime. Lettuce that had turned soft, spotted or floppy, got chopped and thrown into a hot pan of bacon grease before it could rot completely. Add onions. Stir until everything surrendered. Then came the water, a splash of vinegar, and sometimes a bit of flour to make it cling to the spoon. It was more of a stew by mood than by definition. The leaves melted into the broth, green turning brown, flavors turning sharp and smoky. This was a dish built by desperation and rescued by memory. Your grandmother probably called it summer soup or garden stew to dress it up. But everyone knew it was wilted, it was what was left. And still, somehow, it was comforting. There is something quietly heroic about taking what the world says is garbage and turning it into dinner. Lettuce stew was not proud, but it was honest, and in that honesty lived a kind of strange, stubborn beauty. Eggshell bone broth stew was the kind of dish whispered about, not for flavor, but for what it represented. Eggshells were rinsed, dried, and dropped into a pot of bones and water, not for taste, but for calcium. The shells would dissolve over time, thickening the broth and leaving behind a faint, chalky depth. Into this went carrot tops, celery leaves, onion skins, every forgotten part of everything. It simmered for hours, sometimes days. What came out was not stew in the restaurant sense, but it was nourishment. It was science turned into folklore. Mothers swore it made children strong. Grandfathers claimed it cured colds. And maybe it did. Maybe the power was not in the minerals, but in the belief that something invisible was still at work. Eggshell bone broth stew was humble, quiet, and a little strange. But in a world where pennies were precious, it meant you could still offer warmth. Corncob jelly was one of the most surprising Depression-era creations, turning what was usually discarded into something sweet and useful. After eating or cutting kernels from corn, families would boil the stripped cobs for a long time until the liquid turned golden. With sugar and sometimes pectin, this liquid became a jelly that spread easily on bread or biscuits. It had a mild corn flavor, slightly sweet, and it gave people a way to stretch ingredients without buying fruit for jams. Since sugar was often rationed or expensive, this jelly was seen as a clever way to create a sweet treat out of nothing more than scraps. Many families remembered it fondly, not only because it was thrifty, but because it represented resourcefulness at its finest. Children often spread it on cornbread or stale bread softened in milk, turning waste into dessert. It may seem odd today, but back then it was pure ingenuity. Caraway cabbage stew showcased the old-world flavors that many American families rediscovered in the 1960s while keeping costs firmly under control. Shredded cabbage simmered slowly with potatoes, onions, and a sprinkling of aromatic caraway seeds until the vegetables softened and the broth turned fragrant. The caraway lent a gentle licorice note that lifted the humble ingredients, creating a stew that was both comforting and unexpectedly complex. A small amount of butter or oil added richness without driving up the price, and the dish required only a handful of pantry staples to feed a crowd. Many families with Central or Eastern European heritage embraced this recipe as a taste of tradition, while others simply enjoyed its hearty simplicity. Served with rye bread or a slice of cornbread, caraway cabbage stew delivered warmth and satisfaction during cold months. It remains a reminder of how immigrant flavors blended seamlessly into American home cooking, offering deep taste and nourishment from ingredients that were inexpensive, widely available, and easy to store through the winter. Canned Vienna sausages were the snack that somehow became dinner more often than anyone wanted to admit. You pulled back the metal lid, revealing 6 or 7 tiny pink sausages floating in mystery liquid. They smelled like salt and metal and something vaguely meaty. You ate them cold, straight from the can, or warmed them in a pot if you had time. Sometimes you served them with crackers, sometimes just with your fingers. No one dreamed of Vienna sausages, but we learned to respect them. They were there when fresh food was not. They tasted like hard times, but also like resilience. They were soft, almost mushy, but full of protein and easy to store. In homes where refrigeration was unreliable and money was always short, these cans were gold. Not because they tasted good, but because they lasted. They were cheap, reliable, always there when you needed something, anything to put on a plate. You never bragged about eating Vienna sausages, but you remembered them, because they saw you through more hard days than you can count. Raspberry vinegar. Spritzer refreshed thirsty guests with a balance of sweet fruit and tangy bite that felt both old-fashioned and new. Church ladies steeped fresh raspberries in cider vinegar and sugar for several days, creating a ruby-red shrub syrup that sparkled like stained glass in the sunlight. When picnic day arrived, they strained the mixture and poured it over tall glasses of crushed ice, then topped each serving with cool well water or fizzy mineral water. The first sip was brisk and lively, tart enough to wake the senses yet mellowed by the natural sweetness of the berries. Children loved the jewel color, while adults appreciated how the drink cut through the richness of fried chicken and buttery casseroles spread across the tables. Because it required only a few ingredients and could be made well ahead, it became a trusted recipe for gatherings where people lingered for hours in the summer heat. It carried the gentle memory of colonial shrubs and old kitchen wisdom, a link between generations that reminded everyone how simple ingredients could create something remarkable and worth passing on with pride. Canned pineapple sandwiches were the kind of sweet and savory mystery that only the 1980s could have invented. You'd take 2 slices of plain white bread, spread mayonnaise on both sides, and add a shiny yellow ring of canned pineapple straight from the tin. Sometimes people added a sprinkle of salt or a dash of chili powder, but most kept it simple: soft bread, creamy mayo, and the sharp sweetness of fruit. The pineapple juice would soak through the bread just enough to make it sticky and tender. It was a strange combination that shouldn't have worked, yet somehow it did. Families who couldn't afford lunch meat still had a way to make something that tasted like effort. The contrast of tangy and smooth, salty and sugary made it oddly addictive. Kids might roll their eyes at first, but one bite usually turned into 2. It was the kind of meal made when paychecks came late and grocery lists ran short, and yet it still managed to feel cheerful. Canned pineapple sandwiches became a quirky comfort across small towns and big cities alike, reminding everyone that even strange pairings can taste like hope. Cracker crumble stew was a last resort dish born from desperation and frugality, made by soaking whatever saltine or oyster crackers were left in weak broth until they turned soft and soupy. The broth was usually just water with a pinch of bouillon or the remnants of a previous soup, anything that could add flavor to the crackers that otherwise lacked substance. Once softened, the crackers thickened the liquid into a thin porridge-like stew that barely satisfied hunger but offered warmth and the illusion of a full meal. Sometimes a dab of margarine or a splash of powdered milk was added to give the stew some richness and creaminess, and in better times a drop of hot sauce brought a faint zing. Children learned not to ask questions about what they were eating. The smell was mild and the texture was soft, but the memory of a more plentiful table lingered in the air. It was a meal born from scarcity, where crumbs and scraps were transformed through boiling into something that could still fill a rumbling stomach. Cracker crumble stew was a humble reminder that even the smallest fragments, when gathered carefully and cooked patiently, could become sustenance and hope. The stew taught survival through acceptance and resilience. It was not a dish for enjoyment, but a symbol of making do, a quiet testament to the strength found in little things. Mock fish cakes were a thrifty invention for families who longed for seafood but could not afford it during the Depression. Instead of fish, mashed beans or leftover potatoes were seasoned with onions and herbs, then shaped into patties and fried. When browned in a pan, they resembled fish cakes in both texture and appearance, providing the illusion of a more expensive meal. Families often relied on beans because they were cheap, nutritious, and available through relief programs, making them the perfect base for this dish. Some households even added breadcrumbs or stale crackers to stretch the mixture further. While it might not have carried the same flavor as real fish, it was filling and hearty, which mattered most in those years. For many children, mock fish cakes became a familiar supper, remembered later with a mix of humor and nostalgia. They embodied the era's spirit of improvisation, turning simple, humble ingredients into something that felt like a substitute for luxury. Zucchini tomato layer. Bake turned overflowing summer gardens into a warm and colorful family meal that fit any budget. Thin slices of zucchini were alternated with canned tomatoes inside a buttered casserole dish, sprinkled lightly with breadcrumbs and a handful of grated cheese. As it baked, the vegetables released their juices, blending with the cheese to create a savory sauce that required no extra effort. This dish became a staple during peak harvest months, when zucchini was plentiful and nearly free from backyard gardens or neighborhood swaps. Home cooks appreciated how easily it adapted to what they had on hand, allowing the addition of fresh herbs or a scattering of leftover rice to make it more filling. Served hot with crusty bread, it offered a complete vegetarian supper that satisfied even the most dedicated meat eaters. The simple preparation, bright flavors, and low cost made it a dependable recipe that graced countless 1960s dinner tables, celebrating the abundance of late summer produce while keeping grocery bills comfortably low for hardworking families. Goulash was not Hungarian, not the kind we grew up with. This was American goulash, elbow macaroni, ground beef, and a tomato sauce that always tasted a little like metal. It was a one-pot meal. No rules, just a way to take cheap ingredients and turn them into something that could feed a small army. Some families used onions, others added garlic if they had it. But at its core, it was just meat, pasta, and sauce. And it was enough. You could scoop it out in huge portions and still have leftovers. It reheated well. It was easy to make. And most importantly, it was cheap. Goulash was the dinner you made when you could not afford variety. It was everything in one dish. And it worked. You knew it was going to be a goulash night when the cupboards were getting low and the mood in the house was just a little more tired, but somehow that big pot of steaming pasta made things feel okay. For one night at least. Ritz Cracker chicken coating turned every oven into a poor man's fryer and every Sunday night into a feast worth waiting for. You'd crush up a full sleeve of buttery Ritz crackers inside a plastic bag until they were fine and crumbly. Then roll chicken legs, thighs, or even drumsticks through a bowl of beaten eggs before covering them completely in the crumbs. Once they hit the oven, the smell alone could fill the house with the promise of something good. The crackers browned just right, trapping all the juices inside the chicken and creating a golden crust that was crisp, savory, and rich without needing oil or a deep fryer. It was crunchy on the outside, tender in the middle, and budget-friendly all the way through. Families loved it because it felt like fried chicken night without the cleanup or cost. Even neighbors could smell it through the windows and knew someone was eating well. It was the kind of dish you could bring to a church supper and proudly pass off as something special. Ritz Cracker chicken coating wasn't just about saving money, it was about finding flavor where others saw leftovers. It was thrift at its finest, and nobody complained about seconds. Potato soup with saltines was the cozy, creamy dish that made cold nights feel warmer with every spoonful. Mothers made it because potatoes were cheap and easy to turn into something hearty. With just a little onion, salt, and pepper, the soup simmered into a smooth, comforting pot that filled the house with warmth. Kids loved watching steam rise from their bowls and dipping saltines until they softened like little clouds. Every bite tasted like care and calm, perfect for nights when the wind outside felt too sharp. It was filling without being heavy and somehow tasted even better the next day. Simple, inexpensive, and deeply comforting, potato soup with saltines became one of those meals kids never forgot. Fish sticks and macaroni and cheese was the dinner you got when your mom had $5, 20 minutes, and nothing left to give. The fish sticks came from the freezer aisle, packed in a cardboard box with a picture that made them look golden and crispy, but never did justice to the soggy reality. You lined them on a baking sheet and hoped they would brown, even though the oven was spotty and the heat uneven. Then came the macaroni, bright orange and neon from a powdered cheese packet, boiled until it was soft enough to forget where it came from. You stirred the cheese in with butter, or maybe just milk if the butter was gone. And there it was, a plate that was hot, fast, and filling. You did not question if the fish was really fish. You dipped it in ketchup or tartar sauce and made peace with the crunch or the lack of it. The macaroni clung to your fork like it knew its job was to comfort. This was a Thursday night meal, a "we'll go shopping tomorrow" meal, a "you're still growing" meal. It was not gourmet, but it was enough. Enough to fill you, enough to get by. Green bean croquettes brought new life to leftover vegetables, turning them into crispy patties that satisfied even the pickiest eaters. Cooked green beans were mashed with breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and a sprinkle of herbs, then shaped into small rounds and pan-fried until golden on the outside and soft within. This dish allowed thrifty homemakers to stretch a handful of beans into a full meal, pairing perfectly with a dollop of ketchup or a simple white sauce. Children loved the crunch, and parents appreciated the low cost and quick preparation time. Green bean croquettes also demonstrated the growing influence of European cooking techniques in American kitchens, where frying and breadcrumb coatings were becoming increasingly popular. Served alongside a salad or a scoop of mashed potatoes, they brought variety and texture to the dinner table without adding strain to the grocery budget. Their lasting charm lies in the way they prove that even the simplest leftovers can be turned into something special when treated with care and creativity. Boiled radish stew was a sharp, bitter concoction that few sought out by choice, but many depended on when fresh vegetables were scarce. Radishes, usually sliced thin for salads, took on a new role when gardens failed or stores ran empty. They were chopped roughly and boiled until soft, releasing a pungent, peppery aroma that filled the kitchen and lingered in the mouth. The broth turned a dull, pinkish gray, with floating chunks that reminded eaters of the tough times they endured. Sometimes a bit of oil or vinegar was added for complexity, but the stew remained a blunt, honest dish, one that made no apologies for its austerity. Eating boiled radish stew was a lesson in endurance and acceptance, a reminder that survival meant eating what was available, no matter how unappetizing. It was a dish of necessity and stubbornness, of making the best of what little was left. The memory of its taste carried a strange pride, as if simply having it on the table was proof that nothing had been lost completely. Sweet corn silk stew sounds like a dish from a dream, but in reality it was a product of ingenuity born from scarcity. After the kernels were stripped from the cob, the delicate silky threads were saved instead of discarded. These threads, often dried or steeped in water, were used to add body and a subtle sweetness to broths and stews when real corn was scarce. It was never a dish of plenty, but it was always a dish of hope. Sweet corn silk stew was a quiet reminder that every part of a plant had value, especially when food was precious. It showed the resourcefulness of those who refused to waste even the smallest scraps. In a time when hunger was common, turning something so delicate into nourishment was an act of creativity and survival. It connected generations to the land and to memories of abundance now lost, but never forgotten. Vegetable scrap. Broth was a dish that truly embodied Depression-era thrift. Onion skins, carrot tops, potato peels, celery ends, and even wilted greens were all collected in a pot. Boiled with water and sometimes flavored with a pinch of salt or herbs, these scraps produced a thin but flavorful broth. Families drank it plain or used it as a base for dumplings, bread, or rice. Though light, it delivered warmth and the illusion of variety when true variety was scarce. Mothers often saved scraps throughout the week to ensure nothing was wasted, turning what others might throw away into life-sustaining meals. Children may not have loved it, but they drank it because there were no alternatives. The broth was proof of resourcefulness, showing that even scraps could keep hunger at bay. For many households, it was a survival staple, and the memory of scrap broth lingered as a reminder of how every bit of food mattered in those lean years. Hamburger rice skillet pie demonstrated the 1960s knack for stretching a pound of meat to feed a crowd. Ground beef was cooked with onions, peppers, and a generous helping of cooked rice before being spread in a skillet or shallow casserole. A biscuit dough topping, brushed with milk for shine, transformed the humble filling into a pie that looked more luxurious than its ingredients suggested. By combining inexpensive rice with a small amount of meat, families could create a dish that was both hearty and economical, perfect for busy weeknights. The biscuit layer soaked up the savory juices as it baked, giving each slice a comforting blend of flavors and textures. Many homemakers wrote this recipe on index cards to keep near the stove because it could be made entirely from pantry staples. Children enjoyed the fluffy crust and mild seasoning, while parents appreciated how it filled plates without emptying wallets. This skillet pie remained a dependable favorite for decades because it embodied practicality without sacrificing taste or warmth at the dinner table. Shepherd's pie was the meal of second chances. You took yesterday's meat, mixed it with whatever vegetables you had, canned peas, frozen corn, even just onions, and laid it down like the foundation of something better. Then you spread mashed potatoes on top like frosting, soft and thick and hopeful. Into the oven it went, and out came something that looked and smelled like you tried. It was the art of disguise. Leftovers turned into something new. Scraps turned into comfort. You scooped it out with a spoon, the layers blending together in a hot, savory mess that never looked perfect, but always felt right. It made the table feel full, even when the fridge was empty. And sometimes that illusion was all you needed to keep going. Shepherd's pie reminded you that with enough heat and time, even the broken pieces could come together. Hot dog boats with melted cheese were the kind of fun, silly, absolutely irresistible meal that made every child feel like dinner had suddenly become a party. Mothers made them by slicing hot dogs down the center, filling the opening with a strip of cheese, and popping them under the broiler until everything bubbled and browned. The hot dogs curled just enough to cradle the cheese, creating that little boat shape that kids thought was hilarious. The smell hit fast, a mix of smoky hot dog and melting cheese that could pull a kid from any room in the house. Mothers loved them because they were cheap, easy, and guaranteed to make even the pickiest eater happy. Kids loved them because they felt playful, almost like something from a carnival. The cheese would stretch when you took a bite, and sometimes it would drip down the side in a way that made dinner feel like an adventure. Served with a little ketchup or mustard, these boats were a masterpiece of budget cooking that tasted far richer than they really were. Kids begged for them constantly because they made dinner fun, filling, and unforgettable. They were one of those meals that captured exactly what it felt like to grow up in the 1960s. Simple joys, simple ingredients, and memories that last a lifetime. Peanut butter bread pudding was the dessert you made when every sweet thing in the house was gone, but no one wanted to end dinner on an empty note. You'd tear up old bread, pour over a mix of milk, sugar, and a few spoonfuls of peanut butter, then bake until the top turned golden and sticky. The smell filled the house like a warm blanket. It was thick, sweet, and rich enough to make you forget how cheap it was. No one wasted bread back then. It was too precious. If you had bananas or raisins, you could toss those in, but most times it was just bread, milk, and peanut butter working overtime. Families made it in square pans or cast iron skillets, serving it hot with a drizzle of syrup if they were lucky. It wasn't a fancy dessert, but it was one that made you close your eyes with that first bite. Peanut butter bread pudding was poor folks' decadence, a taste of comfort that didn't cost a dime extra. Spaghetti with butter and Parmesan shake was one of the easiest, cheapest, and most beloved meals a mother could make in the 1960s, which is exactly why kids asked for it constantly. It started with a pot of pasta boiling on the stove, the steam fogging up the kitchen windows as the noodles softened. Kids loved watching the long strands swirl in the water like they were dancing just for them. Once drained, the pasta went back into the pot where a generous pat of butter melted instantly, coating every strand in a glossy shine. Then came the Parmesan shake, that little green can that lived in almost every pantry kids loved, doing the shaking themselves, even though mothers had to take over to prevent the entire can from dumping into the pot. The flavor was simple but perfect. Buttery, salty, warm, and comforting in a way that made you want to curl up right beside the pot with a fork. Mothers appreciated it because it cost almost nothing and took barely any time. But kids appreciated it because it felt like the kind of meal that understood them. It was soft, easy to eat, and satisfying in a way nothing else quite managed. It tasted like after-school hunger being solved in minutes. It tasted like staying up a little later than normal. It tasted like childhood in a bowl. Kids begged for this dish because it never disappointed, never felt boring, and always made everything better, even on the days that felt long and gray. Spaghetti with butter and Parmesan shake was proof that comfort did not require complicated recipes. It only required heart. Canned tomato sandwiches were the taste of summer when nothing else was left in the fridge. You'd pop open a can of whole or sliced tomatoes, drain them just enough to stop the bread from falling apart, then slather both slices with mayonnaise. A sprinkle of salt and pepper went on top, maybe a little sugar if you came from the South, and that was lunch done. It was cold, slippery, messy, and perfect all at once. The juice soaked into the bread, softening it until every bite felt like a mix of tang and cream. It wasn't a fancy sandwich, but it was the one that kept bellies full on long, hot afternoons when money ran out before the month did. Some people added lettuce if they had it. Most didn't bother. It was simple, nostalgic, and surprisingly satisfying. The flavor was sharp, honest, and comforting in a way that no processed meal could be. It didn't matter that it came from a can. It still tasted like home. Every bite told a story of resourcefulness and grace under pressure. For families in the 1980s, canned tomato sandwiches were proof that even the simplest things could feel like love. Bologna and apple skillet combined two humble ingredients in a sweet and savory partnership that captured the playful side of 1960s home cooking. Slices of bologna were quickly browned in a cast iron skillet, then tossed with diced apples and a small knob of butter until the fruit softened and released its natural juices. The salty meat and gently sweet apples created a flavor that felt surprisingly rich despite the low cost. This dish made excellent use of ingredients that were almost always on hand: inexpensive deli meat and seasonal fruit. Families appreciated its speed on busy weeknights, while children were drawn to the fun contrast of tastes and textures. Served over toast or alongside mashed potatoes, it became a complete meal that proved resourceful cooks could create memorable flavors from the simplest pantry staples. Decades later, it remains a reminder of how imaginative combinations could turn everyday items into an unexpected treat without straining a modest household budget or requiring elaborate preparation. Cabbage roll. Casserole was one of those Depression-era meals that made the most of scraps while still delivering real comfort to the table. Instead of carefully rolling leaves around bits of rice or meat, families would simply layer chopped cabbage with leftover grains, stale bread, and whatever scraps of vegetables they had. Sometimes there was even a small amount of ground pork or beef mixed in, though most of the time the casserole relied on stretching every flavor from the scraps themselves. A little vinegar or tomato juice added tang and moisture, while onions gave it a base of flavor. Once it baked, the entire dish came together into something hearty enough to serve a large family for very little money. The casserole was a dish that spoke to both ingenuity and the realities of the time, because not everyone could spare hours or meat for proper cabbage rolls. Layering scraps turned survival cooking into something close to celebration. Mustard water stew was made by scraping out the last dribble of flavor left in a nearly empty jar of mustard and mixing it into a simple broth. This thin, sharp liquid was stretched with inexpensive fillers like noodles or barley, turning an otherwise bland pot into something with bite and character. Mustard was a rare and precious condiment in hard times, and not a drop was wasted. The stew's tangy, slightly spicy taste lifted the plain starches, making every mouthful feel a little richer than it truly was. Families would carefully save the remnants of their mustard jars, knowing that when combined with water and fillers, it could transform simple ingredients into a meal that almost felt indulgent. It was a quiet rebellion against blandness and hunger, a way to make scarcity feel less like loss and more like resourcefulness. This stew reminds us how small touches of flavor can evoke warmth and comfort, even when the cupboard is nearly bare. It was a meal that whispered stories of survival with dignity in the face of relentless hardship. Sour milk stew was made by repurposing curdled milk, a staple for many families when fresh dairy was scarce or spoiled. The tangy, slightly sour milk became the base of the stew, adding richness and a sharp flavor that masked the blandness of starchy fillers like rice or potatoes. Instead of wasting spoiled milk, which was often unavoidable in days before refrigeration, families learned to transform it into a nourishing dish. The milk's acidity helped break down the starches, making the stew creamy and thick. Jell-O and fruit cup dessert was the jiggly, colorful treat that made every kid's eyes light up the second it hit the table. Mothers made it with inexpensive packets of gelatin and canned fruit, stirring everything together before letting it chill into a wobbly masterpiece kids could never resist poking it just to watch it move. The sweetness was light, the fruit adding little bursts of flavor. It felt festive. Even on the dullest days, mothers appreciated how cheap and foolproof it was. Kids begged for it because it tasted like pure joy. Jell-O and fruit cup dessert was childhood in dessert form, simple and unforgettable. Egg salad sandwiches were the soft answer to a hard life. You started with boiled eggs, cheap, filling, easy to store. You mashed them with a fork, added whatever mayonnaise you had, maybe a pinch of salt, a dash of pepper, sometimes even mustard if you were fancy. Then came the white bread, thin and fragile, sticking to the egg like it was doing you a favor. It was cold, quiet food. Not flashy, not warm, not especially comforting. But it filled the space between hunger and dinner. You ate it standing up over the sink or wrapped in wax paper at school. There was no crust if someone loved you. There was extra egg if someone loved you more. It was the lunch of the working poor, the dinner of those too tired to cook, and somehow it still managed to taste like home. The eggs were never just eggs. They were patience. They were leftovers. They were something made out of almost nothing. And when the fridge was empty except for a carton and a jar of mayonnaise, you knew what you were having. You did not choose it. You inherited it. Sweet and sour cabbage bake turned a single inexpensive vegetable into a lively main dish that brightened even the plainest table. Shredded cabbage was braised slowly with a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and a splash of tomato juice until the leaves softened and soaked up the tangy glaze. A small spoon of butter added just enough richness while keeping the budget firmly in check. The gentle balance of sweet and sour flavors made this casserole appealing to children and adults alike, offering a welcome contrast to heavier meat-based meals. Home cooks valued how it could be made ahead and reheated without losing its texture, making it perfect for church suppers or busy weeknights. Many families served it with thick slices of bread to soak up the flavorful juices, creating a meal that was both frugal and satisfying. This dish demonstrated how careful seasoning and slow cooking could elevate humble cabbage into something memorable, reflecting the creativity of 1960s kitchens where every ingredient was stretched and celebrated for its potential. Rutabaga hash was a clever dish that made the most of rutabagas, which were cheaper and more plentiful than potatoes during the Depression. Families would chop the firm root into small cubes, frying it with onions and whatever fat they could find. The rutabaga softened and browned, giving a texture and taste that mimicked potatoes closely enough to satisfy hungry families. Sometimes scraps of bacon or ham were added for flavor, but more often it was just the vegetables alone. The hash was hearty, filling, and adaptable, often appearing at both breakfast and dinner tables. Since rutabagas grew well in harsh conditions, they were dependable crops when potatoes ran short. Many children grew up not realizing their parents had been serving them substitutes. because the crispy fried cubes tasted so much like the real thing. Rutabaga hash showed how families made necessity feel normal, turning cheap vegetables into meals that could carry them through some of the hardest years in memory. Pickle juice and potato stew was sharp, salty, and oddly refreshing, especially when nothing else was left in the pantry. When the pickles were gone, the jar of greenish brine stayed in the icebox like a dare. Eventually, someone took it. They poured it into a pot with water and potatoes, maybe a sliver of onion, and brought it to a boil. The result was something between soup and briny broth. Tangy, a little sour, but warm. The potatoes absorbed the pickle flavor, softening into something unexpected. It felt almost Eastern European, though no one called it that. They just called it, "What's for dinner?" If there was a hot dog end, it went in. If not, salt and vinegar did the job. Some added a splash of cream to mellow it. Others embraced the bite. It puckered your mouth. It warmed your chest. And it used every last drop from a jar most folks would have thrown away. Pickle juice and potato stew was a testament to the creativity of hunger and the strange comfort found in the sting of salt and sour. Cornmeal drop dumplings in broth were a warm meal born from desperation and a little genius. When meat was scarce and soup looked too thin, a quick cornmeal batter could save dinner. You'd mix cornmeal with water or milk, pinch off little balls, and drop them into bubbling broth to puff and soak up the flavor. They came out soft, dense, and delicious, tiny golden pillows floating in the pot. The smell of simmering broth filled the house, carrying a quiet promise that everyone would eat tonight. It was the kind of recipe that stretched the smallest pot of soup into something that could feed a family. Some added onions or pepper, others just relied on the broth to do the heavy lifting. Either way, it worked. Cornmeal drop dumplings didn't just fill bellies, they lifted spirits. They were proof that a handful of meal and water could turn hunger into gratitude. Egg salad sandwiches were the creamy, slightly tangy meal that kids pretended to be tired of at school but begged for the moment they got home. Mothers made them because eggs were cheap, filling, and easy to turn into something substantial without spending much. The eggs were boiled, chopped, and mixed with mayonnaise, mustard, and simple seasonings, with each family adding their own little twist. Spread thickly on soft white bread, the filling squished gently when kids pressed down for that first bite. The flavor was mild but comforting, cool and creamy in a way that felt special. Mothers loved that it packed well and kept kids full, and kids loved that it felt like a treat disguised as something ordinary. It was fast, cheap, and endlessly satisfying. The quiet hero of 1960s kitchens and a craving that never quite left adulthood behind. Porcupine meatballs sounded fun, until you realized the only thing spiky about them was the desperation they were made from. These were meatballs born in the hard times, made by mixing ground beef with uncooked rice to stretch every last ounce of protein. They simmered in tomato sauce, and as the rice cooked, it poked out like little white quills. That is where the name came from, someone trying to make poverty sound cute. But if you grew up poor, you know this was not about being clever. It was about making half a pound of ground beef feed a family of 5. They were fragile little things, barely holding together, and often baked in the oven or cooked in a pan until the sauce bubbled up like lava. The tomato sauce was always the cheapest kind, canned, oversalted, and slightly metallic. But it masked the blandness, and that was the goal. Sometimes people added onions or eggs if they had them. Most of the time, it was just the basics: rice, meat, and sauce. Dinner done cheap. If you ever sat at the table with 3 meatballs and a slice of bread, you knew what this meal meant. It was survival with a side of improvisation. Tomato custard casserole turned 2 everyday items, canned tomatoes and eggs, into a richly flavored dinner that captured the resourcefulness of the 1960s. The eggs were whisked with milk and a pinch of sugar before being poured over chopped tomatoes and breadcrumbs, then baked until the custard set and the top turned slightly caramelized. This casserole provided protein, vitamins, and comfort all in one dish without requiring expensive meats or elaborate preparation. Many families served it with buttered toast or a simple green salad, letting the natural acidity of the tomatoes balance the creamy custard. The recipe became a reliable weeknight option because it used inexpensive pantry staples that were always on hand. Its smooth texture and gentle sweetness made it appealing to children, while adults appreciated the subtle complexity that developed as the tomatoes baked. This unassuming casserole is a testament to how mid-century cooks could transform basic ingredients into something hearty, nourishing, and surprisingly elegant with little more than patience and a hot oven. Cucumber vinegar salad was a refreshing Depression-era side dish that added brightness to otherwise plain meals. Cucumbers were easy to grow in home gardens, and when combined with vinegar, water, and a pinch of sugar or salt, they became a simple but flavorful salad. Thinly sliced and chilled if possible, the cucumbers soaked up the tangy brine and provided crunch. For families living on beans, bread, and potatoes, this salad was a welcome change in texture and taste. It required almost no cooking, which was another benefit when fuel and time were scarce. Often served in large bowls at supper, it gave the sense of a fresh vegetable dish without requiring expensive ingredients. Sometimes onions or dill were added, but the core recipe was basic and thrifty. For many households, cucumber vinegar salad was a reminder that gardening and resourcefulness could provide something close to luxury in the hardest times. Potato peeling stew was the kind of dish born from a kitchen where nothing could be thrown away, not even the skins. It started with a pot of leftover broth, beef if you had it, salted water if you did not. Into that went the peels of every potato, not scrubbed clean but left with the grit of the day still on them. Onion ends followed, the ones too tough or bruised for frying, and if you were lucky, a garlic clove or carrot stub made its way in too. It simmered on the back burner all day, turning scraps into supper. The broth would thicken slightly, cloudy from starch and mystery. Salt was precious, pepper was a gift, and if someone added a splash of vinegar, you might mistake it for something special. They called it stew because soup sounded too thin, too hollow. It tasted like everything and nothing. But it filled bellies. Children never knew the difference. They just knew the smell meant someone tried. It was survival with a wooden spoon, and somehow it was enough. Boiled hamburger gravy on bread was a working-class miracle that filled bellies and stretched a single pound of beef for days. Instead of frying the meat, folks would boil it in water until it crumbled into soft bits, then stir in flour and a little grease to make a thick, savory gravy. It wasn't pretty, but it smelled like home, and it soaked right through white bread like a promise. Some called it poor man's stew, others called it Tuesday dinner, but it was the same everywhere, simple, hearty, and cheap. It was the kind of meal you made when the fridge looked bare, yet somehow everyone left the table satisfied. The gravy clung to your fingers, the bread got soggy, and no one complained because it tasted like comfort. If you were lucky, you added pepper or onions, but even plain, it hit the spot. This was survival cooking that didn't apologize for itself, just warm, heavy food for long days and tired hearts. Tomato soup with grilled cheese was the rainy day classic that never failed to make kids feel warm from the inside out. The moment a storm cloud rolled in, kids would start hoping their mothers would make this exact combo because nothing else matched the feeling of dipping a buttery sandwich into a bowl of steaming soup. The soup usually came straight from a can, cheap and dependable, mixed with water or milk to make it smoother. As it heated, the rich tomato smell filled the room, promising comfort before you even took the first bite. Meanwhile, the grilled cheese sizzled in a pan, the bread crisping in butter until it turned that perfect shade of golden brown. When the cheese melted completely, stretching in strings when you pulled the sandwich apart, you knew dinner was going to be perfect. Kids could barely wait for the soup to cool down before dipping the sandwich into it, soaking up all that warmth and flavor in one bite. It was simple, cheap, and so easy that mothers could make it even on their most exhausted days. But it never felt tired or ordinary. It felt like kindness in a bowl. It tasted like being taken care of. Kids begged for this meal because it felt like a warm hug. the food equivalent of being wrapped in a blanket while the world outside stayed cold and gray. It was childhood comfort at its absolute best. Sloppy Joes were chaos in a bun. They were sweet, tangy, sticky, and somehow always managed to spill no matter how carefully you ate them. This was not just a school lunch special. It was dinner for anyone trying to make a pound of ground beef stretch to its limits. The sauce was ketchup, sugar, vinegar, and maybe a splash of Worcestershire if your family had that kind of spice rack. You browned the meat, dumped in the sauce, stirred it until it bubbled, then plopped it on the cheapest hamburger buns you could find. The kind that disintegrated under pressure. If you were feeling fancy, maybe you toasted the buns. If you were feeling realistic, you just got paper towels ready. Sloppy Joes made no effort to be elegant. They were messy, loud, and comforting, the kind of meal that made a mess of your face and your plate, but you ate every bite because it tasted like sugar and salt and home. You ate fast because it would soak through the bread if you waited, and you never complained because this was one of the good ones, one of the rare meals that actually felt like a treat. Cheese-topped rice ring turned plain rice into an eye-catching centerpiece that delighted both family members and guests while keeping costs low. Cooked rice was mixed with beaten eggs and lightly seasoned before being pressed into a greased ring mold and baked until firm. After unmolding, the golden rice ring was filled with a medley of creamed vegetables such as peas, carrots, or spinach, then topped with a scattering of melted cheese for a touch of richness. This presentation gave the appearance of a special occasion dish despite relying on everyday pantry staples. Home cooks enjoyed how flexible the recipe was, allowing them to use leftover vegetables or whatever cheese they had available. It provided a balanced meal of grains, vegetables, and dairy while remaining budget-friendly and easy to prepare ahead of time. Cheese-topped rice ring stands as a testament to the imaginative flair of 1960s kitchens, where economical ingredients were transformed into something festive and memorable that could grace both a Sunday dinner table and a neighborhood potluck with equal success. Cabbage coleslaw proved that absolutely nothing went to waste in the Depression era. While most people today throw away the tough core of a cabbage, thrifty families of the 1930s shaved it finely to make a crunchy salad. With vinegar, a little sugar, and maybe a pinch of salt, it transformed into something tangy and surprisingly refreshing. Carrots or onions, if available, might be added for color and flavor, but often it was just the cabbage core itself. It became a side dish for meals that otherwise would have been too plain or heavy, adding brightness without any real cost. This slaw was a simple reminder that waste was not an option, and even what many considered garbage could become a dish worth serving. Families learned to enjoy the sharp taste and crunchy bite, and for some, it even became a regular part of the dinner table. Tomato bread stew was proof that two forgotten foods could become something unforgettable. Stale bread, hard enough to cut your hand, was cubed and tossed into a pot of tomato juice and water. Onions sizzled in lard before being added, bringing sweetness to the sour. The bread soaked, softened, and dissolved just enough to create a thick, almost porridge-like stew. It was crimson and steaming. The smell was tangy and sharp. Some called it kitchen mop stew behind closed doors. But when it hit the bowl, it looked like something out of Italy. Poor man's panzanella. Depression gazpacho. The names changed. The need stayed the same. It filled stomachs with warmth. It taught children to chew slowly. Tomato bread stew was not a meal you boasted about, but it was one you remembered, because it reminded you that even in the leanest days, the heart could still hunger for flavor, and sometimes it found it. Canned Vienna sausage stew was the 1980s answer to dinner when the paycheck ran dry, but you still needed to feed everyone. Pop open a can of Vienna sausages, slice them up, and throw them into a pot with instant potatoes and green beans from another can. Let it all simmer in broth until the flavors came together, and you had a meal that felt bigger than it was. The sausages were soft, salty, and oily enough to add richness to the pot. It was a one-dish dinner that didn't need measuring cups or fresh anything. Moms across America called it pantry stew, and it filled houses with that familiar smell of survival and ingenuity. You'd eat it with white bread to soak up the gravy, and for a few minutes, everyone forgot how tight money was. It was a recipe that belonged to those who refused to go hungry, even if all they had was a can and a stove. Canned spaghetti and meatballs was the simple, straight-from-the-can miracle that 1960s kids thought tasted like restaurant food. Mothers bought it because it was cheap, fast, and required nothing but heating. The noodles were soft, the tiny meatballs were tender, and the sweet tomato sauce felt comforting and familiar. Kids always rushed in as soon as the can opener clicked, knowing exactly what smell would fill the kitchen next. It was messy, fun, and easy to eat. The kind of dinner kids slurped instead of politely ate. Mothers relied on it for long days and tight budgets, and kids loved it because it felt like a treat. It tasted like late dinners after playing outside and simple joy without explanation. Canned spaghetti and meatballs were cheap comfort disguised as something special. Cabbage and noodles, Pulaski if your grandma called it that, was a gift from the old country wrapped in poverty. You boiled egg noodles until they were soft, but not mush. You fried cabbage and onions in butter or oil until they collapsed into golden ribbons. Then you tossed it all together and prayed the flavor was enough. It was peasant food, proudly so. Born from resourcefulness, not recipes. Even when money vanished, this meal stayed dependable, like a friend who never left. It was not pretty, and it did not try to be. Just beige on beige with a hint of steam. But it filled the house with the kind of smell that made you feel like someone was taking care of you. Even if that someone was just you, doing your best. The dish had roots in Eastern Europe, but in American kitchens it became something else. An immigrant memory passed down through empty cupboards and tight budgets. You could eat a giant plate for under $1 and still feel like you ate something real. Because you did. Of cuts without the price, an idea perfectly suited to the frugal 1960s kitchen. Ground pork was blended with breadcrumbs, minced onion, and a touch of milk before being seasoned with a bit of sage and pepper to mimic the gentle taste of veal. The mixture was shaped into a loaf and baked until the top formed a golden crust and the inside stayed moist and tender. A light tomato glaze or brown gravy completed the illusion, giving families a hearty centerpiece that felt far fancier than its ingredients suggested. This recipe became a favorite in community cookbooks and church fundraisers because it fed a crowd with ingredients already on hand. Leftovers made excellent sandwiches the next day, stretching the value even further. By transforming simple pork and pantry staples into something that seemed luxurious, mock veal loaf embodied the clever resourcefulness that defined many mid-century American dinners, proving that satisfying flavor did not require an expensive shopping list or complicated preparation. Dandelion coffee was one of the many substitutes that appeared when coffee beans were either unavailable or unaffordable. Families would dig up dandelion roots, roast them carefully until dark, and grind them into a coarse powder. When brewed, the result resembled coffee in both color and aroma, though the flavor carried a bitter earthiness all its own. For those accustomed to real coffee, it was not quite the same, but it became a daily ritual that provided both warmth and comfort in lean times. Children and adults alike drank it, often with a little sugar or milk if available to soften the bitterness. Because dandelions were free and abundant, the drink spread widely in both rural and urban areas. It symbolized the Depression's spirit of using whatever nature offered, even weeds, to replace expensive imports. For many families, dandelion coffee was not just a beverage, but a reminder that comfort could still be found in the simplest, most overlooked places. Cold fish stew was part chowder, part dare. It started with canned sardines, oil and all, mashed into a pot with boiled potatoes and powdered milk. No heat. Just stirring. The milk made it creamy, the fish made it salty, the potatoes made it thick, served cold. Not by choice, but because the stove was broken, or the gas was off, or the summer heat made cooking unbearable. It looked like gruel. It smelled like the sea. But it was protein. And it filled the gut. Some added crackers, some added hot sauce. Others just swallowed and said thank you. Cold fish stew was not about taste. It was about calories, about making sure no one went to bed hungry. And it stuck with people, because it proved that even the strangest combinations could mean survival, and sometimes even comfort. Instant coffee meat rub was one of those oddball ideas that somehow worked. You'd mix instant coffee crystals with sugar, salt, and a pinch of flour, rub it on cheap cuts of meat, and throw it in the oven or pan. The coffee acted like a smoky glaze, turning the outside dark and caramelized while hiding the fact that the meat was tough as rubber. It was a poor man's barbecue, full of flavor and pride. Families used it for pork, chicken, or whatever protein happened to be on sale. The smell filled the house like something from a steakhouse, and everyone gathered around pretending it was a special occasion. Even if the meat was chewy, no one complained. The magic of that bittersweet crust fooled everyone into believing it was better than it was. It was one of those small miracles from a time when making dinner meant making do. Jiffy corn muffins with jelly were warm, golden treats that made ordinary mornings feel like something sweeter. Mothers loved how quick the mix was, needing only a splash of milk or water before going into the oven. As they baked, the house filled with a sweet, buttery smell that made kids hover until the timer rang. Split open while still steaming, each muffin melted the grape jelly spread across its soft center. Every bite was sweet, warm, and comforting, the kind of food that felt like a hug. Kids loved their small size and always reached for more than one. Mothers appreciated how affordable they were and how long a batch lasted. Kids begged for them because they tasted like childhood in its simplest, happiest form. They were a small luxury in a decade full of stretched budgets. Cream-chipped beef on toast was the kind of meal that did not ask for approval. It just showed up. Soldiers had it in mess halls, factory workers had it on break. And if you grew up poor, you probably stared at that milky white sauce clinging to thin strips of salty beef, wondering why it always tasted like desperation with a pinch of comfort. The dish was nicknamed SOS, and no, that did not stand for Save Our Souls, though maybe it should have. It was stuff on a shingle, if you want the cleaned-up version. A slice of toast, barely toasted, because who was wasting electricity on that? Then came the sauce, a flour-thickened mix of butter, milk, and cheap dried beef. Sometimes not even real beef, just salty mystery meat that tried its best. It hit the plate with a wet slap, and you ate it not because you wanted to, but because it was there. Because there was nothing else. It was World War leftovers cooked for peacetime kitchens, and it filled you up, whether you liked it or not. Today, it lives mostly in memory and old military cookbooks. But for those who ate it every week, it is not something you forget. You never really forget what it feels like to scrape the last bit of sauce off your plate with a slice of bread you wish was thicker. Hominy and bacon casserole offered hearty satisfaction with minimal ingredients, highlighting how resourcefulness defined many mid-century meals. Creamy canned hominy provided a naturally sweet base that absorbed the smoky flavor of crisp bacon bits sprinkled throughout. A light sauce of milk and butter bound everything together before baking, creating a dish with comforting richness despite its simplicity. Families often served it as a main course with a side of green vegetables or a slice of cornbread, making it a complete and inexpensive dinner. Hominy's long shelf life and low price made it a dependable pantry staple, while just a few strips of bacon added enough depth to please meat lovers without straining the budget. The casserole reheated beautifully, so leftovers were welcomed for quick lunches the next day. Its combination of smooth texture and smoky taste made it popular at potlucks and church gatherings where thrifty recipes were always appreciated. Hominy and bacon casserole remains a testament to how modest ingredients can deliver true comfort and memorable flavor when prepared with care and creativity. Stuffed beet leaves showed how Depression kitchens wasted nothing, not even the leafy tops of common root vegetables. Instead of throwing the greens away, families boiled them briefly to soften and then filled them with small portions of rice, breadcrumbs, or leftover scraps of vegetables. Rolled tightly, they resembled stuffed grape leaves, though much humbler in taste and presentation. Sometimes onions or herbs were added if available, but most of the time they were seasoned simply with salt or vinegar. This dish was especially popular in rural homes where beet crops were plentiful and gardens were a lifeline. Stuffed beet leaves carried a sense of novelty for children who might otherwise turn up their noses at plain greens. Adults valued them for stretching scraps into something that looked and felt more like a real meal. Even in their simplicity, they managed to bring variety to dinner tables that often repeated the same foods day after day. They remain a forgotten reminder of how every single part of a plant had value when survival depended on it. Dandelion leaf stew was a springtime ritual born from empty shelves and overgrown yards. When money was tight and gardens hadn't yet bloomed, people turned to the weeds. Dandelion leaves, foraged from roadside and yard, were bitter, angry almost, but full of vitamins and bite. They were washed in cold water, boiled down twice to tame their fire, then dropped into a pot of beans or potatoes. A bit of pork fat if there was any, maybe onion. The result was green and earthy, like drinking the backyard. Children turned up their noses. Adults didn't blame them. But they ate it anyway. Because it was free. Because it was food. Because it meant survival. The bitterness became part of the experience, not something to fix. Dandelion leaf stew didn't pretend to be anything but what it was. But that honesty mattered. In lean times, it reminded families they could still provide, still forage, still make do. And sometimes, that was all anyone needed to keep going. Cold spaghetti sandwiches were the proud invention of leftovers and late nights. You'd open the fridge, see a bowl of yesterday's spaghetti, and realize that bread was the only thing left. So you'd scoop the cold noodles right onto the bread, fold it over, and take a bite. It was messy, chewy, and surprisingly satisfying. The sauce soaked into the bread, turning it into something that didn't need reheating or plating. It became a classic among factory workers, college kids, and tired parents who didn't have the energy to reheat a pan. It might have looked ridiculous, but it worked. It was dinner without dishes. Cold spaghetti sandwiches were proof that comfort food doesn't have to make sense. It just has to make you full. Sloppy Joes on toasted buns were the messy, lovable dinners that 1960s kids acted like they could not live without. The name itself promised a meal where neatness did not matter. Mothers loved that 1 pound of meat could stretch far when mixed with sauce and seasonings. The skillet popped as the beef cooked, and when the sauce hit the pan, the whole house filled with that warm, tangy smell everyone recognized. The buns were lightly toasted to keep them from falling apart. Not that it ever worked. The sandwich dripped, slipped, and made a mess, and that was the entire point. Every bite was comforting and familiar, the kind of food that made a plain evening feel like something to look forward to. Mothers liked how fast and cheap it was, and kids begged for it because it felt like dinner made just for them. Sloppy Joes were childhood joy disguised as dinner. Television dinners were what happened when the future met the food budget. Frozen meals in foil trays, stacked in the freezer like little time capsules of convenience. Salisbury steak, mashed potatoes, peas or corn, a square of apple cobbler that always burned your tongue. You pulled it from the box, popped it in the oven, and waited. No prep, no planning. Just peel back the foil and pretend you were eating like everyone else. These dinners were born in the 1950s, but they stuck around because they made sense. Especially when you worked late or your parents were too tired to cook, or there just was not enough of anything to make a real meal. The food never looked like the picture. But it was hot. It had variety. It felt like a feast when you only expected a sandwich. You ate it in front of the television, a tray on your lap, the glow of the screen making it all feel a little more okay. These dinners were never about flavor. They were about escape. Carrot marmalade was a sweet spread that helped families feel like they had something luxurious for breakfast, even in the toughest years of the Depression. Sugar was precious, but when it could be managed, grated carrots simmered down with citrus peel made a bright orange jam that tasted far richer than its ingredients suggested. Citrus itself was not always available, so many recipes leaned heavily on the carrots, using peel or extract when possible. The finished marmalade was thick, fragrant, and easily spread across homemade bread or crackers, turning simple staples into something that felt festive. Children loved its sweetness, and parents appreciated how it stretched a handful of carrots into enough jam to last for several mornings. Many community cookbooks published carrot marmalade recipes, encouraging families to rely on what they could grow in gardens. It was a dish that turned scarcity into creativity, and for many households it became a small comfort that brightened otherwise plain and repetitive meals. Cabbage core stew was a lesson in patience and pride. Cooked from the part most folks tossed in the compost without a second thought. The outer leaves were long gone, pickled or boiled to mush, but that white, dense center, that was the prize. Chopped down like firewood and simmered low with onion, salt, and any grease left in the skillet from breakfast. The longer it cooked, the sweeter it turned, losing that bitter bite and softening into something resembling food. A potato might make it in. Maybe a strip of bacon rind if someone had been paid. This was not a dish you bragged about. It was a dish you endured. But it was warm. It was soft. It was food. And in a world where waste was a sin, it meant you had not given up. Cabbage core stew was what your grandmother made when the cupboard was down to its last whisper. And still, she served it with a smile. Because shame does not live in an empty pot. It lives in forgetting how hard people once fought to fill it. Pickled watermelon rinds turned what many would throw away into a sweet, sour preserve that families treasured during the Depression. When fresh fruit was too precious to waste, thrifty homemakers saved the tough white rind of watermelons. These rinds were boiled with sugar, vinegar, and spices until they softened and took on a tangy sweetness. Stored in jars, they became both a condiment and a dessert, brightening up otherwise bland meals. Children loved them for their unexpected flavor, and adults valued how nothing went to waste. Victory gardens often produced watermelons, and in households where money was scarce, even the rinds had value. Pickled watermelon rinds were served alongside beans, bread, or meats when they could be found, making ordinary meals feel more lively. Many families kept recipes for these preserves, passing them down as reminders of how every scrap could be used. The dish was both resourceful and flavorful, embodying the resilience that defined Depression-era cooking. Ramen noodles were the dinner of desperation that somehow became a ritual. A block of dried noodles, a packet of salt and spice, and 3 minutes in boiling water. That was it. That was the whole recipe. And yet, it kept showing up in pantries, college dorms, first apartments, and homes where money ran out before the month did. You could dress it up, sure, but no one was fooled. It was hunger food, dressed in hot broth and convenience. And somehow that truth only made it more familiar. You slurped it straight from the bowl, steam burning your face, the broth clinging to your lips. Sometimes you added an egg, sometimes hot sauce, but most times you just made do. The noodles were limp, the broth was salty enough to sting, but it was food, and food meant one more night survived. You did not eat it because you wanted to. You ate it because it was all you could afford, and you learned to love it anyway. Mustard green spaghetti was a Southern experiment that worked better than it had any right to. You'd boil spaghetti noodles, toss them in a pan with wilted mustard greens, and hit it with a dash of hot sauce for punch. The greens were bitter, the pasta plain, but somehow it came together into something hearty and bold. It was the perfect marriage of Italian thrift and Southern grit. Some folks added a spoonful of margarine to mellow the greens. Others went heavy on the spice to make it sing. It was an accidental recipe that spread through kitchens where fresh produce was rare and creativity was required. Mustard green spaghetti might sound strange to anyone who didn't live through lean years, but for those who did, it was genius. It filled your stomach and left you proud you'd made something out of almost nothing. It was humble food with heart, and that made it better than any restaurant plate. Creamed corn over toast was the sweet, unexpectedly beloved meal that kids liked far more than they ever admitted. Mothers made it because canned corn was cheap, and a quick stovetop simmer with milk or butter created a creamy, comforting topping. Poured over warm toast, it soaked in just enough to soften the bread without making it soggy. Kids loved the sweetness, the warmth, and the way each bite felt like a kinder, gentler version of dinner. It was simple, soft, and soothing, perfect for days when appetites were unpredictable. Mothers appreciated that it required almost no ingredients and filled hungry stomachs quickly. Kids begged for it because it felt familiar and safe, like a meal meant just for them. Creamed corn over toast was one of those small, surprising favorites that only grew more nostalgic with time. Rolled oat meatloaf was another way people made do when meat was a rare luxury during the Depression era. The idea was simple. Oats were cheap, filling, and easy to find, so they became the backbone of many loaves when ground beef was scarce. Housewives would combine rolled oats with onion, a little broth or tomato juice, and perhaps an egg if one could be spared, then bake it until firm. The oats took on the flavor of the few seasonings and drippings that were used, giving the illusion of meat even if very little was present. If there was any beef or pork to add, it stretched further thanks to the bulk of the oats. Served with gravy made from pan drippings or even a thin tomato sauce, it could feel hearty enough to pass for the real thing. Many families came to appreciate the flavor and comfort it provided, even without meat. Buttermilk potato pancakes were a beloved solution for leftover mashed potatoes and a shining example of kitchen thrift in mid-century America. Cold mashed potatoes were combined with tangy buttermilk, a beaten egg, and a bit of flour to create a batter that fried up into golden cakes with crisp edges and fluffy centers. Served hot from the griddle, these pancakes paired beautifully with applesauce, sour cream, or a simple sprinkle of salt and pepper. The recipe offered a new life to yesterday's potatoes, ensuring that nothing in the kitchen went to waste. Families welcomed the comforting aroma that filled the house as the pancakes cooked, making even an ordinary weeknight feel special. They were hearty enough to stand alone as supper, but also worked well alongside a small slice of ham or a bowl of vegetable soup. Easy to make and quick to cook, these pancakes became a regular part of many 1960s dinner rotations and remain a reminder that frugality can be delicious when handled with care and creativity. Gristle stew was the dish nobody admitted to liking, yet everyone finished. It started with the bits no one wanted, the chewy, sinewy ends of meat, fat-laced scraps, bones too small to be worth anything else. Trimmed from roasts, picked from soup bones, saved in foil until enough gathered to make a meal. These tough pieces were tossed into a pot and cooked low for hours until they softened into submission. Onions, carrots, potatoes, anything to round out the bowl. The broth turned thick with collagen and flavor, rich in a way only struggle can produce. Gristle was not pleasant. It fought the teeth. It dared you to chew. But it was protein. It was sustenance. And in homes where pride was secondary to survival, it was eaten with quiet determination. No one bragged about it. But they remembered it, because it reminded them that even the unwanted parts could serve a purpose. Gristle stew was not about indulgence. It was about not letting go of anything with value, even if that value was hidden deep in the chew. Prune whip was one of the Depression's simplest yet most surprising desserts. Prunes, being affordable and long-lasting, became a pantry staple, especially in rural areas. To make prune whip, stewed prunes were mashed and folded into whipped egg whites, creating a fluffy, airy dessert that felt far richer than its ingredients suggested. Sweetened with a little sugar if available, it became a favorite treat for children who rarely saw sweets at all. Parents valued it for stretching a small amount of fruit into enough dessert for the whole family. Served in bowls or even glasses, prune whip looked fancy, adding a sense of celebration to otherwise plain meals. It was often reserved for Sundays or special occasions, giving families something to look forward to. Though forgotten today, prune whip symbolized Depression-era ingenuity, turning a single affordable fruit into a dessert that carried joy. In the toughest of years, it proved that even hardship could be softened with sweetness. Grilled cheese and tomato soup was the closest thing to comfort food that poverty could buy. 2 slices of bread, a single slice of cheese. Into the pan it went, sizzling in butter or margarine until golden brown. You flipped it once, maybe twice, careful not to burn it. The cheese melted just enough to glue it all together. You knew this was poor man's food, but it never tasted that way. It tasted like someone tried. It tasted like effort, not leftovers. Then came the tomato soup, hot, red, and straight from the can. You poured it into a chipped bowl and dipped the sandwich in until it softened at the edges. That was the bite. The one that made it feel like someone cared. This was a sick day meal, a snow day meal, a we still have cheese meal, and it felt like a hug every time. Even now, the smell alone can take you back. Pancake batter corn dogs were the carnival you made when you couldn't afford the fare. You'd mix up a bowl of pancake batter, slice hot dogs into chunks, and spear them with whatever you could find: forks, chopsticks, or even straws. Then came the best part: dipping each one into the batter and dropping it into hot oil until the outside puffed up and turned golden. The smell alone could make the whole block jealous. Sweet, crispy, and greasy in all the right ways, they were chaos turned delicious. Families made them on Friday nights when they wanted to give the kids something fun without spending anything extra. Sometimes they dipped them in syrup, sometimes in ketchup, sometimes both. There were no rules. You could fry 10 of them for the cost of one real corn dog, and everyone got seconds. They were crunchy on the edges, soft in the middle, and gone in minutes. Pancake batter corn dogs were a reminder that joy didn't need money. It just needed a little imagination and a lot of hot oil. In a world that felt hard, these golden bites brought a little laughter back to the table. Cold spaghetti omelet transformed yesterday's dinner into a surprising lunch treat that delighted thrifty church cooks. Leftover spaghetti, often sauced lightly with tomato, was folded into beaten eggs, seasoned with black pepper and a touch of grated cheese, then poured into a hot skillet. As it cooked, the pasta strands settled into a golden crust while the eggs puffed gently around them. The omelet was flipped once to achieve a crisp exterior and a tender interior that sliced easily into wedges. Served at room temperature, it traveled well and stayed tasty even after hours on the picnic table. This dish reflected the inventive spirit of home cooks who refused to waste a single noodle and proved that a satisfying meal could come from simple leftovers. Children enjoyed the playful texture, while adults appreciated the hearty flavor that paired perfectly with fresh greens or sliced tomatoes from the church garden. It stood as a testament to resourcefulness and the belief that no blessing, however small, should ever be thrown away. Potato soup was the warmth you clung to when the cold came early and the paycheck came late. You peeled potatoes with dull knives, boiled them in water, and added onions if you had them. The broth was made from milk, or sometimes just more water and hope. It was not fancy. It was not thick. But it was hot and filling and honest. Some families added cheese or bacon bits if they had a little extra. Most just salted it until it tasted like something. You ate it slowly, holding the bowl in your hands like it might warm more than just your fingers. Leftovers were poured into jars and reheated for the next night. It was the kind of soup that stretched itself to meet your needs. It never judged you for having nothing else. And in that way, it did more than feed you. It forgave you. Stewed apples with bread cubes was a dessert that stretched every bit of fruit to its fullest during the Depression. A few apples, sometimes bruised or close to spoiling, were peeled and stewed with sugar or molasses if available. To make the dish go further, stale bread cubes were added to soak up the syrupy juices. The result was a warm, comforting pudding-like dish that could serve several people with only a handful of apples. Spices like cinnamon or nutmeg might be added when they could be spared, but even without them, the dish was sweet and filling. For many children, this was the closest thing to pie they would taste during those years. It turned waste into dessert and brought comfort at the end of long days. Even though it cost next to nothing, it felt like a treat worth remembering. Stewed apples with bread cubes showed how creativity kept hope alive. Sawdust dumpling stew did not have real sawdust, but you might have thought it did. It started with stale bread, so dry it crumbled like wood, and was shredded into dust, soaked in water, and mashed into a heavy paste. That paste got pinched into lumps, dropped into a weak broth made from bones or salted water, and boiled until swollen. The dumplings held their shape, barely. They were gray, dense, and heavy as stones. But they gave the illusion of a full pot. A single onion or garlic clove made it sing. Some added a splash of vinegar, others a pat of lard. But the dumplings were the point. They made you chew, they made you full, and they reminded you that bread, even at the end of its life, still had one more job to do. It was not elegant, but it was enough. And in kitchens where the wind blew through the cracks in the wall, that mattered more than taste. Velveeta potato bake was the crown jewel of the comfort table in the 1980s, and it didn't take much to make. Just a few peeled and diced potatoes, a splash of milk, and a handful of bright orange Velveeta cubes that melted into creamy gold. The whole dish bubbled and hissed in the oven, turning every corner of the house into a buttery, cheesy paradise. When you opened the oven door, the smell hit first. Rich, warm, and unmistakably fake, but somehow perfect. The top browned slightly while the middle stayed soft and gooey, thick enough to scoop but smooth enough to melt on your tongue. Families brought it to church potlucks and Sunday lunches, always disappearing before anything else on the table. It was the definition of cheap cooking done right, the kind of dish that cost a few dollars but felt like a treat. Kids thought it was fancy, parents knew it was survival. Velveeta potato bake didn't pretend to be healthy or refined. It was comfort in its purest form. It was a casserole made with love and necessity, proof that a block of cheese could turn poverty into pride. Flour paste stew was what happened when flour, water, and hope met in a single pot. A roux of sorts, but made with margarine instead of butter and water instead of broth. Stirred over low heat until it thickened into a pale, gluey base. Salted, maybe peppered, and then extended with whatever scraps remained. Bits of carrot, half a potato, dried onion flakes, or even a spoonful of mustard. It clung to the spoon. It filled the bowl. It didn't look like much, but it had weight. It stayed in the stomach. That was the goal. Children called it paste stew and giggled, but they ate it anyway. It was warm. It was filling. It gave the illusion of plenty. Some added canned meat, others just breadcrumbs. The goal wasn't flavor. It was fuel, and it worked. Flour paste stew was the definition of making do, of thickening up nothing until it felt like something. It may have stuck to the pot and to the ribs, but it also stuck in the memory as one more way people refused to go hungry. Which poor man meal from your family's past deserves a comeback? Share your memories in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep honoring these resourceful recipes together.